Good evening, fellow denizens of the planet Earth. I am going to review another video of our mutual good friend Capturing Christianity in a moment. I know it's been a little while. You know how things are. You get busy and working on various things at the moment. So I've got a little bit of time this evening, so I thought I'd do another little Cameron catch-up. Before I started, I wanted to do a little experiment. I know my lighting setting isn't optimal here. I don't have a fancy lighting setup and anything like that, but I've realized that I can improve the lighting on my face by using light mode on my computer. And look at the difference in just the ambient light in the room when I switch to using light mode. This is just a mostly white screen. Look at the difference here. It's just insane. I don't understand how people can use light mode and not like destroy their eyes. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. So I will attempt to. There we go. That's turning. Look at that. That's just turning light mode on. Just StreamYard. It's just the borders that change, but still, that's the extra light that I get on my face. It's absolute insanity. Anyway, so that's why dark mode matters, folks. Anyway, that's by and by. I was just doing some experimenting, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Let's catch up with our friend Cameron here, and see what's been going on in his space lately. So, I think the unfortunate reality of all of this is that. Oh, that doesn't do anything. The unfortunate reality of this is that Cameron produces videos faster than I can review them because, you know, he does this like mostly full time. And I just do this periodically between like trying to write a book and write a thesis and working on an EA conference and doing a science podcast and whatever the hell else I spend my time doing. So I have to be a bit selective, but nevertheless, I think it's useful to just have a quick peek at what's been going on since I last entered into the domain of Cameron. And as usual, we can see the typical lineup of absolutely premier intellectual content. Chem, ham, and creationist. Just, I mean, if something doesn't say pinnacle intellectual achievement like Ken Ham, I don't know what does. Definitive way to defeat the problem of evil. You see, it's in all caps, so you're supposed to yell it. This could actually be interesting. Was Jesus crucified, Christian versus Muslim? I wonder how similar the Muslims' arguments would be to mine. Maybe I'll do that at some point. Something about chairs beginning to exist, reviewing Mr. Beast, because, you know, of course we have to do that. I don't know what that has to do with Christianity, but whatever. Something about William Lane Craig and the origin of life. I don't know why that is something William Lane Craig's talking about, because he doesn't have any expertise there, but, you know, whatever. Going to the videos now, as opposed to live, which consists of videos but that aren't videos. So we go to the video section to get the videos that are videos instead of the videos that are not videos that are on the live toolbar. Makes perfect sense. I don't know why anyone would be confused about that. We've got Joe Rogan. Apparently, Craig went on Joe Rogan for some reason. I don't know why. I mean, we all know that Joe Rogan is a pinnacle of intellectual achievement as much as Ken Ham is, but I suspect that William Lane Craig might just have had the better of him on that exchange, but you know, maybe I'm wrong there. His first real possession. We've got more demon stuff. Why does God allow possession? Asking the big questions here. Simple test that exorcists use. I think that Cameron Capturing Christianity should just change the subtitle here instead of exposing you to the intellectual. Where's the full thing? How do I get the full thing? Oh, well, what's this arrow do? I guess it just takes you to the about page. Oh, that's weird. Anyway, instead of saying I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief, it should just say I'm exposing you to the demonic possession side of Christian belief, because that's what the channel seems to be mostly about these days. You know, more clickbait like this, astronauts, Jesus and Santa. Yes, they're doing TikTok responses now, Cameron and some other channels that I've seen, like what's the other one that I reviewed sometimes? Trinity Radio also have moved into the TikTok response business, because of course that's where the pinnacle of Christian intellectual and you know, philosophy of religion intellectual content is. It's on TikTok. So anyway, that's what's happening there now. But one video that particularly caught my eye was this one here. AI consciousness and AI consciousness, the soul and God's existence, with Eric Hernandez, whom I've reviewed before, I believe. And, you know, that always makes for an interesting presentation. So I thought I'd give this a go. Obviously, AI is something that's of interest to me because I research large language models, which have obviously made a lot of headlines recently with Chat GPT and GPT-4 and all of the other ones. Not quite sure what that has to do with the soul, but I guess we'll find out. This is quite long, so I don't know how much of it I'll get through, but we'll see how we go. Let's jump right into it then. I haven't watched this before, so we're going in raw. We're going in unprepared.
Hey guys, welcome to
Holy
Capturing
moly.
Christianity. Okay, so
is that just on my end, or is that super loud? Why is that so loud? I can't tell if that's going to be on your end as well. Hang on. Let's try to adjust this.
First of all, this is I'm trying some new things here. So I've got Eric Hernandez with me in person. We're doing a debate CC Exchange 23 with Justin Schieber. He and Justin Schieber are debating God's existence.
Hopefully that's more reasonable on your end. Let me know in the chat.
He also just kind of lives not too far away, but I can't believe this is like the first time that we're actually like doing any kind of work together. But let me say this. So this is kind of new for me, having like we've actually got 2 camera angles. Let me
hang on. I have a few comments to make here. Is this like Craig Keener's Selection of Miracles there? Unless that's the same book twice, but I don't know. I guess there's lots of miracles. I wonder what that is. Probably systematic theology, something or other. We've got a Mandalorian helmet there. That's kind of cool, although the show went downhill. But you know how these things are. I've got a couple of rocks. I don't know what the significance of that is. Is that a fossil of some sort? Looks too big to be a fossil, but I don't know. Is that like Plato or Socrates or something? Non-Christian, very suspect. Well, what's this one here? Why? No, who, age, the... Oh, I can't read it. I don't know, urn thingy. Now, this got my attention here. Is it just me, or is it... This globe is clearly upside down, right? That's Australia, Indonesia. Like, why is it upside... And there's Antarctica there. Why is it upside down? Is it supposed to be upside down, or has it been knocked over or something? That's just bizarre. Like, why? I find that offensive. Like, I mean, just put the Northern Hemisphere up. It's just, I don't know. All right. Anyway, you can't preach it if you're not loud. Yeah. Well, good point. Anyway, let's keep going.
This is kind of new for me, having like we've actually got 2 camera angles. Let me show you. Look at that. Just beautiful close-up shot. Look at that. Just look at that face. I don't know if I can watch this. Look at that face. I actually watched that what would you say? We're kind of not getting directly on the topic yet. Maybe you guys can just stick around. This is gonna be a fun conversation. So what is like one of your most memorable debates that you've
I don't care about this.
Not to take Professor Pena's class because he's antagonistic towards Christianity and religion, and his goal is going to be to make me lose my faith.
Yeah, I think I heard
in my life I heard an argument that if true would prove Christianity false. The reason I say that, and without unpacking all the details, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false, and he even says people should feel sorry for us for how gullible and dumb we are for believing this. That's the Eric James version.
Based.
And suffice it to say, again, without going into the details, for the Pharisees, which Jesus would have adhered to, Paul was a Pharisee. Their eschatology involved what John Cooper calls a 2-step eschatology: intermediate state and resurrection. And because yes, we're getting a physical body, but it's also me that is being resurrected with the physical body. But if there's no soul, how can there in principle be that kind of a resurrection? And if there's no resurrection, well, then how could Christianity be true by the same token that Paul's arguing? So I could ignore it or brush it under the rug, and I'm not.
What does the soul have to do with the resurrection? Like, the whole point of resurrection is that it's bodily. So if you bring the body back together, then you're alive again, right? Why do you need a soul into that? I have no idea why there's any connection between those two. I mean, I'm not saying you can't have a soul in the picture, but it doesn't seem strictly necessary. In fact, it seems to make more sense to me that the whole affair is bodily, because otherwise, why bother with the body in the first place? Just be a spirit, like God is, or I don't know, the Holy Spirit. Like, why the flesh if that's sort of optional? I don't understand this at all.
I'm not the kind to just sweep things under the rug. So to make a short story long,
classic apologist material there to make a short story long.
After I had graduated from that and got my bachelor's in theology, this school, I remained good friends with the chairman of that philosophy department, and who was my first philosophy professor. And we'd talk every now and then, and they would do these roundtable discussions every semester with the philosophy department, and you got extra credit if you went. And I remember the first time I went,
rookie mistake.
that was the first time I heard of and saw Professor Pena. And again, the next semester I'd be taking his class. And I noticed that, so there were 4 people on this panel. It was a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian, and then an atheist. And they would ask a question like, what role does religion play in our society, or should it play? And the first person to answer was a Christian, then went down the line. And the last was the atheist. And the Christian said something like, well, I'm a retired 4-year missionary and we've built wells and, we've gone and fed children, yada, yada, yada. Then when it got to Pena, the atheist, he said, well, first of all, I don't think religion should play any role. And if you're going to go with what she said, well, then you're not even doing it for the right reasons. I'm an atheist and I do those things and I don't have those motivations. So, kind of appealing to be more virtuous and whatnot. And suffice to say that every question was that way. Christian would answer, he would kind of make her look silly. Well, going back to after I graduated from this community college, the chairman actually contacts me and says, hey, we want to do another roundtable on religion. Would you be interested in representing the Christian side? And I was like, sure, yeah. I was at that point already into apologetics and whatnot. And I said, out of curiosity, who's going to be on the panel? And sure enough, Pena was one of them. So it starts, and I'd say within 10 minutes of it starting, the first interruption happened, and that's when I was giving like my, not opening, but it was just kind of informal. He interrupts me, and from that point on, it was pretty much he and I going back and forth for the rest of the time. The students loved it. The chairman loved it. We did that 1 or 2 more times. All this time this was happening.
I assume none of this was recorded?
Gosh, I think it was. I don't know where it would be on YouTube. I think I didn't record it. Someone did, and they put it on their channel, but they may have deleted the channel since then. But all those, it was once a semester, and I got to do this.
There better be a good punchline to this because this is taking a long time.
Did it at San Jacinto, did it. He came up to me, not knowing my connection with Pena, said, hey, I noticed every time you guys do this, it's always you and him going back and forth. Would you be willing to debate him one-on-one on God's existence at my church? And I was like, yeah, sure. So, we both said yes. So what's interesting is that I remember leading up to that, let's say like 2 weeks before the debate, he calls me and he kind of starts to apologize. And he says, I'm really excited about this, but the church doesn't think people are going to show up to this. So they were going to put you in the sanctuary, but instead they're going to put you in the gym. Hope you're not offended. I'm like, I've never done this one-on-one, so, I'm good with whatever. Day of the debate, I get there about an hour early, to kind of get settled in, study, pray, and whatnot. And again, he meets me at the door and starts apologizing again and says something like, they only give us 200 chairs. They don't think a lot of people are going to show up, but if we need more chairs, we can. Hopefully you're not offended.
200's a lot.
About 15, 20 minutes before it starts, I'm in the back room. I kind of peek my head out just to see who showed up. Well, those 200 chairs were full. They pulled out 200 more chairs. Those were full. And there were people standing along the back and the side of the church, and people were still walking in. And that night, including online, there was about 600 people who watched that. And that night, there were more atheists than Christians at church because of how influential this professor was. So yeah, again, to make a short story long, that had to be my most memorable because aside from it being my first, I think the impact that it made was just pretty profound.
Well, it also kind of makes sense of like
the punchline was a lot of people showed up. Okay.
Your interest in the arguments for the soul, right? That's kind of like, that was the first person who actually challenged you on that. Right. It made you see that maybe there is actually like a connection between that and Christianity. And then, so that actually is interesting and insightful into like why you've focused on that.
Yeah. And what's kind of funny / sad too, I'll tell it this way. Sometime after our debate, I went up to him and I said, I know you're an atheist, so I don't know how you're going to take this, but I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life, because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And he kind of just, smirked and whatever. But what's sad to me is that what got me into apologetics wasn't being inspired by some Christian or some pastor or some youth pastor. It was because of 2 atheist philosophy professors. I think that's sad because even if God wanted to use a Christian to push me in this direction, he couldn't, because there were none in my life who did it. I didn't know what apologetics or philosophy was. In fact, I intentionally took a class in philosophy because I thought philosophy was just sharing your opinion and making stuff up. And I was good at both of those. So I'm like, I could skip this class, and still pass.
Philosophy, just sharing your opinion and making stuff up.
But again, fell in love with it. And, I'm reminded of what Christ said, that if you don't cry out to me, these rocks will. So to me, these 2 atheist philosophy professors were rocks. God used to crown in my life because no other Christian.
I don't remember that verse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if I've said something similar to my brother, because he's the one, his journey into atheism was the impetus for me starting my journey into apologetics. So I don't know if I've said anything like that to him, but I definitely should thank him for playing his part.
Yeah,
it just seems like a very paradigmatic case of pointless suffering. And so what I did is I do obtain consciousness. Then do they have rights?
Oh, hang on. I think
especially with the recent advancements of things like Midjourney, the extent of my knowledge of AI, other than using ChatGPT for various little things here and there. But I mean, this is like a huge topic now. Everyone is talking about AI, especially with the recent advancements of things like Midjourney for image creation, and then ChatGPT. And then, so it's becoming more and more in the forefront of the minds of the culture right now. So, and one question that's being asked so often is, are these AI, artificial intelligence, is ever going to get to the point where they obtain consciousness? I mean, that alone is an interesting question, right? But then there's the question of like, what are the implications of that? Some people think if they do obtain consciousness, then do they have rights? And what does that look like? And then another question would be more specifically in the religion arena, would be something like, if we can create consciousness, then what does that say about like God? Does that mean that like, it doesn't seem that difficult actually to create consciousness? And so some people have actually used arguments from consciousness for the existence of God. And even this book that I've got right here from Josh Rasmussen, he's got some some arguments in here that you can't basically build consciousness out of physical materials. There's these like construction problems that you face. And so if it does,
is that the Lego bricks argument? That one where he talks about if you put a bunch of Lego bricks together, it doesn't become conscious or something, and so therefore the brain couldn't be conscious. I remember doing a video. Yeah, that was Josh Rasmussen. I remember doing a response to that in a discussion with Cameron. I don't know when that was, last year sometime. If that's the quality of the argument that he has, then oof, I can't imagine what's in that book. Anyway, let's see what they have to say about this.
We it's happened to create consciousness. What does that mean for these different arguments for God? And then there's a whole lot of implications. But let's start back at square one. As someone who has, you spent years studying dualism and consciousness, and so what are your thoughts on AI and consciousness? Do you think that AI is ever going to get to that point?
As if spending years studying dualism gives you any insight or knowledge whatever about artificial intelligence. But anyway, let's see what
no, I would think it's metaphysically impossible. But aside, like a preliminary remark, so if you and I, growing up, we're about the same age. When we got into apologetics, like the Kalam was like the thing to go to, and it's still a great argument.
Yeah.
But what you now notice is that nowadays atheists are familiar with the Kalam, right? Because like back then you'd use the Kalam, maybe they weren't familiar with it. But now
it depends on what you mean by familiar.
Fair enough. Yeah. They've heard it before. Yeah. Right. Put it that way.
Let me also make a caveat. I'm not saying that like all atheists are just completely ignoramuses, but I am saying that a lot of
most of them are.
Most of them are. No, but a lot of them just haven't done the deep work and the deep study on these arguments.
But like when
not the deep work and study that you've done, Cameron. Intellectual powerhouse.
Kalam was first out there. Of course, everything starts in the academic, then kind of trickles down. It takes some time, but it made a pretty big impact, and I think it still does. But now people are more, given they've heard it before, they now have kind of responses to it. So it almost kind of lost that. For some people, it kind of lost that newness to it, that punch. I think,
we had this argument, but atheists have shown how crap it is. So now we've got to find a different argument to use. Oh, gosh, talk about telling on yourself. Like, why would you say something like that?
Hope too, but I think the existence of consciousness is now going to be the next kind of Kalam impact. So I would recommend to any young aspiring apologist, get some consciousness understanding, philosophy of mind, under your belt, because I think that's going to have huge impacts, and I would love to see arguments from consciousness be as widespread as the Kalam.
I think that is super good. I mean, I'll pull up this book one more time. So you guys probably can't really see it that well. We're kind of far back here, and then there's a glare on it and everything. The book is called Who Are You Really by Joshua Rasmussen. The subtitle, A Philosopher's Inquiry into the Nature and Origin of Persons. And so what Josh Rasmussen did recently is as a professional philosopher, he did a deep dive into consciousness, and he wanted to really ask the question, what are we made of, and what are we? And he's appealed to consciousness, and he's well known. I would say probably the most well known philosopher right now, working on arguments from contingency. And so he has he's got a lot of great books. One of them, it would take me probably too long to find it on the bookshelf. It's called How Reason Can Lead to God. And in that book, he develops an argument from contingency, but then he also appeals to different data that get it together. What is that?
My spinner.
Oh, okay.
To fidget.
Sorry, you got me distracted. So he appeals to no. He appeals to consciousness at some point in that book as some sort of like at least a reason to think that if there is a foundation of reality, then it's got to account for consciousness somehow. And so how do you do that? One of the ways is you just give it consciousness. And so consciousness.
Why does the foundation of reality have to account for consciousness? I mean, does the foundation of reality have to account for the existence of bronies? There's people who like My Little Pony. I mean, does the foundation of reality have to account for the existence of, I don't know, Donald Trump? Like, obviously it has to be consistent with the existence of anything that exists, but to say that it has to account for it seems odd to me. I mean, the foundation of reality doesn't really have much of anything to do with things that exist at a much higher level of complexity or organization. That's a very strange comment to say that because consciousness exists, therefore it must be accounted for by whatever the foundations of reality is. That's a huge leap to assume that there's any connection of them whatever. It seems to be pretty much assuming the conclusion that the foundation of reality is fundamentally conscious instead of non-conscious, as I would say it is. But
can come out of consciousness. So anyways, but yeah, just to kind of go back to what you were saying, like new apologists, if they're wanting to get into the apologetic scene and really champion an argument, then I 100% agree that consciousness is a great area to go into.
Yeah, and consciousness, soul, when all falls under philosophy of mind. So can AI be conscious? So lots of things to say. One thing is that I think that one of the first things
earlier you said that it's metaphysically impossible,
right? So to kind of as some groundwork, I would first say that consciousness is not identical or reducible to the physical. Because when we look at anything, we first want to ask, what's the nature of a thing? So what's the nature of consciousness? And if we take theism and naturalism as our two live options, then right off the bat, it would seem that consciousness fits more on a theistic.
Why are theism and naturalism the only two live options? That's a serious problem I have in these discussions, that that always seems to be assumed that those are the only two live options, instead of views that are neither theistic nor naturalistic, like at least traditional Buddhist philosophy is atheistic, but certainly not naturalistic in a modern scientific sense. You can argue about Hinduism, whether that counts as theistic or not. I guess there's different varieties of that. And there's pantheistic and panentheistic philosophies. There's people who are panpsychists, but certainly not theists. You can be a substance dualist without being a theist either, for that matter. I don't understand why there's such a lack of imagination about this. You're supposed to, you being Eric here, is supposed to spend years studying dualism, but then he's just like, oh, well, naturalism and theism are just the only two live options. Well, where does that come from? That might be important, right? Because if we're going to say that naturalism can't account for consciousness, therefore theism must be true, the only way to do that is to assume that theism is the only other option. So that's kind of an important key aspect of this sort of argument here, which I think is what, based on what he said and what I've heard him say in the past, is sort of what he's going to be saying here. But that's just an absurd thing to just assume, right? Like, why would you think that? Why think that those are the only two live options? Because I'm a naturalist myself, but I think that we have to seriously consider other options as well. If we're to take this line that, well, maybe naturalism can't account for consciousness, well, then how can we account for it? And just jumping to God as the usual default option of apologists just is so lazy, in my view. I don't understand why they keep doing this.
Just a point of view, given that at fundamental reality, you have an unembodied mind. I, in a discussion I had with David Smalley, it was actually the second one. Like when he asked me if I thought there could be minds without brains, I'm like, of course I do. And he was so shocked.
Remind me to come back to those discussions that you had with him.
Oh yeah, sure.
Love to talk about this.
He was so shocked. Oh my gosh, you can believe there's a mind without a brain. I'm like, you realize I'm a Christian. How is that shocking to you? When at the core of Christianity, there's an unembodied mind. So
God.
Yes, right, exactly, God.
If you're not a theistic personalist, you don't actually think that God is a mind. You may think that he has sort of aspects of a mind, but it's sort of not clear that the God of classical theism is a mind or is a person. I think different people would say different things about this, but my view is that it is highly suspect. Even forget about any neuroscience or modern psychology. Just think about folk psychology and the things that we ascribe of the things that we ascribe to minds, like the capabilities of minds, things like desire, motivation, memory, an individual personality, problem solving, decision making, things like that. And think about how many of these capabilities or functions that God has or could have or would have. It seems that he wouldn't really have any of these, right? God doesn't need to problem solve. He doesn't really remember anything. He just kind of knows everything. So there's not really a memory there. Does God have a personality? I mean, it's sort of unclear what that would mean. Maybe that's maybe a tricky one. I suppose God doesn't really make decisions either. It's not like he needs to weigh different considerations. He just acts, right? God doesn't have drives. He doesn't have like a pituitary gland or hypothalamus or anything like that allows our nervous system to interact with the endocrine system, which is part of what makes minds the way they are, is their interaction with hormones and things like that. So the point is that, I guess that's going into a bit of science, but the point is that folk psychology seems to have very little to say about what a divine mind would even be. So it seems highly suspect that you can even use the same word. I mean, you can use whatever word you like in one way, but if you have to say, well, it's a mind, except it doesn't have essentially any of the properties that we normally, or functions or capacities that we normally think of minds as having, then is it really a mind or is it something else? It seems like it's only a mind by analogy, in the same way that the Bible talks about God's hands and things like that. Then maybe we can talk about his mind, but that's obviously analogical talk, or it uses the masculine pronoun when obviously God doesn't have a sex, right? So I think that there needs to be serious interrogation of how appropriate it is to ascribe a mind or mental faculties to God, given how vastly different that type of mind, if we're going to call it that, must be to our types of minds. Again, even putting aside the sort of scientific questions. And this is just never interrogated by apologists. At least I've never seen it interrogated by apologists. It's just sort of taken for granted that, oh, it's a mind, even though it's almost nothing like any mind we actually know or experience.
So what is consciousness? And suffice it to say that when you look at the features of consciousness, and there's various arguments that point to consciousness as the nature of consciousness being immaterial, to even ask and answer these questions, one thing important to understand is what's called Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. We can just call it Leibniz's law for short. And essentially states that if two things in question are identical, say some X and Y, then whatever's true of one is true of the other and vice versa. So if Eric Hernandez is the same person as your guest, then whatever's true of Eric Hernandez is true of your guest. Now, this also implicitly gives us a test for identity. So take again some X and Y. If I can find just one thing true of X, not true of Y, or vice versa, they're not the same thing. Well, if we're just going to, for the sake of simplicity, if naturalism.
Wrong. Geez, how hard is this, right? Notice what he said there. He started talking about Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, and explained that in terms of if two things are identical, then they must have all the same properties, and all things that are true of one must be true of the other. So that's true of two things that are identical. But then he said just after that, if there's one thing that's true of one but not true of the other, they can't be the same thing. That's not the same as identity. Now, this might seem like a nitpick, but this sort of thing is essential if you're going to do philosophy properly, insofar as there is a way to do it properly, is to be cautious and precise in what you're talking about. So in philosophy, you would usually distinguish two things being identical with them being the same thing, because something can be the same without being identical. And what I mean by that is you can refer to something using different names. So this is the idea of a distinction between sense and reference. So one example is, the morning star and the evening star. Now, both of them refer to Venus, right? So the morning star is the same thing as the evening star, but at least under some conceptions, you wouldn't say the morning star is identical to the evening star, because one is seen in the morning and the other is seen in the evening, right? So there's different senses of which is sometimes described as modes of presentation of the underlying referent, which is the planet Venus. And of course, people originally didn't necessarily know that the morning star and the evening star were actually the same planet. The point is that being the same thing could refer to just picking out the same object or system or the same substance in the world. Words don't have to be, or like propositions don't have to be identically true, like in all the same circumstances, to pick out the same thing. So identity is different from being the same thing, or at least, under certain conceptions of it, it can be. And this is really important when you're doing philosophy of mind, right? Because most identity theorists are not going to want to say that the brain and the mind are identical in the strong sense that all propositions about the mind must be true about the brain, because there are going to be things that we would tend to say about the brain that are not true of the mind. I don't know, like the brain consists of neurons and glial cells, whereas you probably wouldn't say the mind consists of that. Maybe you would, right? But there are, he's probably going to give some examples where it would seem that we would predicate something of the brain, but not of the mind. And so, one very simple way around this is to say, well, brain and mind refer to the same thing, but they're just sort of different ways of talking about it, so that all of the propositions in question don't necessarily have the same truth values. Just like the morning and evening star example for Venus. So this is a sort of a philosophy of language issue here, where we have to be very careful about what we're doing with words and how we're tapping into our intuitions here. And what Eric said just in that couple of sentences there illustrates a lack of care, a lack of precision about this, which to me is just the mark of, either being disingenuous, which, I don't know, or just being really sloppy, just not really caring or knowing about these sorts of things, and being clear about the sort of argument that you're presenting, because people do make arguments about, why the brain and the mind can't be the same thing, but just to appeal to the indiscernibility of identicals and then just slip into saying that they can't be the same thing, that's too sloppy. That's not going to work, right? But let's see where he goes with this.
I would even argue that naturalism it's most logically consistent for a naturalist to be what's called a strict physicalist, and say that consciousness is either identical or reducible to the physical. Either it is physical or...
Yeah, identical and reducible to are also quite different things, but let's see how he passes that.
Some say that it's caused by, dependent on, emergent from the physical. Setting that aside, you're going to have to make it somehow physical or pushing it that way. But given Leibniz's law of identity, we know they're not. Why? You take brain states and mental states.
No. Hang on. Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals is only going to work for a very strict form of identity theory, where you say they're literally identically the same thing, like in all senses. All propositions about the brain must be have the same truth values as all propositions about the mind, right? And I don't really know of many people who accept that, precisely because of the sorts of examples that he's going to give, where it seems like that they have different truth conditions. And so instead, what most physicalists about the mind would say is some of the things that he just mentioned. So he knows about this. They would say that it's reducible to the mind, or it's the mind is reducible to the brain, or the mind is emergent from the brain, or it's composed of, the mind is ultimately composed of or instantiated in, or something like that, a physical substrate. There's different language around this, and different philosophical debates about precisely what account you want to give. But these accounts are different from each other, and these differences matter, because an argument against one is not going to be an argument against another. He can't just sweep that under the rug. As someone who doesn't like to sweep things under the rug, he's already swept quite a lot under there from my point of view. You can't make an indiscernibility argument against physicalism and then just ignore all of these different varieties, because this is not going to work against those varieties. If I say that the mind is reducible to the physical, then indiscernibility of identicals isn't going to work against that, because I'm not saying it's identical. I'm saying it's reducible to it. And then maybe we could argue about, well, brain states and mind states and the connection between them. But there's a big discussion to have there. And you can't just say they're not identical, because I'm not saying they're not identical. And most physicalists don't say they're identical in that simplistic way. How can you not appreciate this when you've studied dualism for years? And in fact, I think he does appreciate this, because he kind of mentioned it, but then it just got swept under the rug as if it didn't matter. But it's crucial to this argument that he's making.
5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition, or acts of will. And even using Leibniz's law there, we know they're not the same. How so? Well, take a thought and belief. If there's one distinction between them, they're not the same thing. And you can easily think of the fact that I can have beliefs that I'm not thinking, and I can think things that I don't believe. So they're not the same thing. So take a thought. A thought can have the property of being true or false, but a brain state can't have the property of being true or false. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds. The thought I'm talking to you doesn't weigh 3 pounds. And
so what do you mean?
Yeah, so that's a good example, right? So you normally wouldn't. I think the first one is a bad example, but the second example of brain states, you wouldn't normally think of as them having. Mental states, you wouldn't normally think of them as having, say, a location, or at least not a precise location, or you wouldn't think of them as having a mass, for example, whereas brain states clearly do. So that's one example that people like to give. To me, that's just an indication of that there's different languages that we use to talk about things from different perspectives. So the mental perspective is sort of a psychological perspective, whereas a neurological perspective is more of a biological. And so the psychological perspective abstracts away from questions of like precise location or mass or things like that. And so it doesn't really make sense to ask, like, how much does that thought weigh? And in that sense, yes, the physicalist, I think, should say that a brain state is not identical to a mental state in that sense, right? At the type level, for those who keep track of such things. But one thing you would say instead, there's different ways that you can pass this out. I don't want to be too prescriptive about the right way of doing that. But one way is simply to say the psychological state is instantiated by or is reducible to a physical state. And so things that we would not predicate of the psychological state, we would predicate of the physical state. But all of the psychological properties are reducible to or are true in virtue of, are grounded in, that there's another sort of terminology, grounding, are grounded in the physical state. Any of those approaches, whichever one you take, supervenience, grounding, instantiation, realizability, whatever, any of those things circumvents this simplistic identity, like type identity sort of argument. And I think Eric knows this, because he kind of mentioned them just before, only to sort of sweep them under the rug, which of course he doesn't do, because he doesn't sweep things under the rug. So how is this anything approaching a good argument? Like, this is ridiculous.
My brain state.
Right. So a state would be a mode that a thing is in. So if we look at something like water, water is a substance, and it can exist in 3 different states. And if you know the properties of a thing, it'll point you to the kind of state it's in, and it'll even tell you about its nature. It'll tell you something about its nature. So if I say water is in a solid state, has a property of solidity, you know it's in a solid state, and it tells you the kind of thing water is. It at least gives you some clues. So a brain state would be something like neurons firing, or something that the brain's doing, neuroplasticity, elasticity, whatever the brain's doing. It's in a certain state.
Did he say neuroplasticity, elasticity? Neuroplasticity is a thing. Neural elasticity, I've never heard of. I don't think that. Let me actually just double check that in case this is like some 5 brain thing. Neural elasticity. No. Oh, did my camera go weird there? No, neural elasticity definitely is not a thing. Oh, gosh. Maybe you need to bone up on a bit of basic neuroscience there, Eric. Neural elasticity, that's a new one.
State. And suffice to say that there are states of the mind and brain and vice versa, that it can be true of one thing but not the other. So again, they're different. They can't be, so consciousness can't be identical or reducible to the physical. That's kind of how I just kind of quickly make that point. And so now if consciousness is not physical, then the next question is, what is the thing that possesses consciousness? And conscious mental state.
So let me back up just a little bit. So it sounds, I mean, you're making this, you're appealing to this Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. And is that what it's called? Yes. Identicals? And so what you're pointing to, like you're contrasting, okay, this thing.
By the way, I just want to point out, there's no need to use such highfalutin complex language to describe a fairly basic idea that if A is identical to B, then everything that's true of A must be true of B. They must have all properties in common. You don't have to call it Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. I don't know why there's a need to do that other than to make it seem more profound or learned or whatever than it really is. Now, you know, I wouldn't take so much of an issue with that if there was a consistency about being very precise and using the terms that are used in the literature and things like that. But there's no consistency there. We've got one term that's this big mouthful that attempts to sound, you know, more sophisticated than it really is. And then we just sweep all of these actual issues under the rug about the relationships between mind and brain. And we're just talking about this crudest possible form of identity theory. What are we doing here? It's like we're play acting philosophy instead of doing actual philosophy. What I'm talking about, I'm not saying that we have to be, you know, PhD philosophers of minds or anything like that. I'm talking about the stuff that you would see in a basic, you know, first year level university text on philosophy of mind, or you know, the most basic Wikipedia article about this sort of stuff that explains these sort of different theories about relationships between mind and brain and how identity and you know, reduction and different views are passed out. And instead, what we're getting is this sort of, you know, charade of doing philosophy, but no actual substance behind it. Or at least there hasn't really been so far. And Cameron seems already confused about what we're talking about when we talk about brain states and such. But I mean, let's see where we go with this.
X versus this thing, Y. You're saying this thing, X, has at least one property that Y does not have.
Something true of it, sure.
Something true of it, yeah. Well, yeah, so it has this true property and this one it doesn't have that true property. And so when it comes to a brain state, I think one of the things that you said is that like a thought can be true, right? But then you said that a brain state cannot be true, right? And so that would show that you've got these two different properties that these two things have, and that would show that they're not identical to each other.
Right. Identical. Yeah. And
so a thought cannot be identical to some physical brain state.
Yeah, that's right.
And what you're thinking of here, right? And when you're saying brain state is like a neuron or like
a certain so a state would be like an event. If
it would be like a physical event happening in your brain.
Right. A brain state would have to be a physical event, right?
Yeah.
And then mental events aren't physical. So, and we can show that by showing they don't share the same properties.
Yeah, I think Eric didn't do a very good job of explaining what a brain state is. It's just supposed to be a particular configuration of whatever substances and now I'm not doing a very good job. A brain state is just a particular configuration of stuff in your brain, right? So you can think of it as a particular configuration of neurons arranged in a certain way, firing in a certain pattern and whatever. So that constitutes a brain state. It's like a snapshot of your brain at a particular time. I guess you could think of it as a series of states over time, but it seems that it's usually conceived of as like a snapshot at a point in time. And then a mental state is, again, some particular configuration of thoughts or feelings or beliefs or whatever, so some aspect of your mind or someone's mind at a point in time. So that's a state that minds can be in. And the idea is that brain states and mental states can't be identical to each other because they have different properties. So things that are true of one aren't true of the other. You know, I kind of agree with this if we're talking about it at a sort of a type level. I think, yeah, well, we didn't get into the specifics there unless they get into it. But anyway, the point is that this is not like some profound point that Eric's come up with or that's even recent in the literature. This has been debated about, this sort of thing's been debated about at least 100 years. And there's a lot of discussion about the way to think about the relationships between mental states and brain states. I've just mentioned a few ideas about whether you go with reductionism or whether you go with the idea of supervenience or whether you go with the idea of realization or grounding. There are different ways to explicate the relationships between mind and brains, but what they share in common is essentially to say the mind is something different to the brain, but not different in substance, different in essentially the way we talk about it. So we use different sets of words and concepts to talk about the mind compared to the brain. And so that's why some things that we say about brains, we wouldn't say about minds and vice versa. But anything that's true about the brain, anything that's true about the mind ultimately is true because of things that are true about the brain. So there's a direct connection between them. There's nothing else that makes mental states the way they are, apart from just the way that brain states are. And that's all the naturalist needs. They don't actually need this sort of type identity that Eric is sort of talking about. All they need is there to be nothing else apart from brain states that make mental states the way they are.
An illustration I've given is like, say you walk into a lab and you see 2 bottles of clear fluid, and without using any tools, scientific tools, you want to ask, are they the same substance? So what you can do is apply Leibniz's law of identity. And you see that they're both fluids. They both have the property of being clear. So you assume at this point, perhaps they're the same substance, because one says water, but the other one says chemical X. But let's say the label is ripped off. So you think they're the same substance until you turn over the one with the label ripped off and it says constant flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical this is, I at the very least know they cannot be the same thing, because one has a property true of it that's not true of the other.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really helpful test. So if consciousness is not physical, we can then ask what possesses it. Mental properties are what are called kind-defining properties. By knowing the property, kind-defining properties tell us about the kind of thing needed or required to ground or possess it. So the simple way to put it is thoughts have thinkers. So if there's you can't have a thought without there being a thinker. So if consciousness exists and it's immaterial, what possesses it? Well, I know one thing for certain that possesses consciousness, and that is me. And I use the word I possess consciousness. The word I is what's called an indexical word. It refers to things like here and there are indexical. So what is the I or self? The word I. So that being said, if I possess consciousness and it's immaterial, what kind of thing am I? And this goes into, again, without going into all the complicated details of it, I'm going to argue that I'm not identical nor reducible to the physical. Again, using Leibniz's law of identity. Like if I retain identity through change and part replacement, then I'm not identical or reducible to the physical. Jaegwon Kim, a secular philosopher, gives a really interesting argument for that. Just to kind of explain it, he says something like, in 2011, this brain and body did not exist. Because every 7 to 10 years, your body replaces almost every cell. So he says in 2011, this brain and body didn't exist, but I did exist in 2011. Therefore, I'm not identical or reducible to a brain and body. So what kind of thing am I? I would say that.
So that I don't think that reducible clause there applies. So it may be true that you're not identical to your body. I think that that's true actually. But I don't think it follows you're not reducible to your body. This is another question though. We're flipping between different issues here, because it could well be that the issue of the continuity of the self over time is a different issue from the relationship between mind and brain, and they're usually discussed separately in the philosophical literature, because they involve a lot of separate issues. I mean, not to say that there's no connection between them, but I feel like we're jumping around a little bit here. So I'll just
given that consciousness is immaterial, it's a defined kind-defining property. Well, then you would need some immaterial substance to ground it, namely the soul, is what I'm going to jump to. Now, all that to say, for something to be conscious, I would argue it needs a soul. And then let's look at something like AI. There's a lot of problems with saying that AI would be conscious. One is, I would argue that it would need to have a soul to be conscious in the first place. And we talked about kind-defining properties. When you look at everything that exists is going to have a nature, an essence, and that essence is going to set limitations of what it can and cannot do. An acorn's essence, its nature, has the ultimate capacity to be put in the dirt and grow into an oak tree. But if I put you in the dirt, that won't happen. So that shows me that your ultimate capacity doesn't.
What is the essence of a dirty sock? Just let you to think about that one.
Contain that faculty capacity. So there are limitations to a thing's capacities given its nature. Now, if we're going to take a physicalist perspective, then you're going to have to assume by looking at the physical, there's going to have to be some kind of indicators, and I'm kind of simplifying for the sake of time, indicators that there are at least potentially these capacities to at least possess consciousness to begin with. Suffice to say, I don't see any, unless you just assume panpsychism, which I think has other problems. But it was, I think, Leibniz who said, he was one of the first to kind of argue that if you were to like walk into a big mill room and you would see objects pushing and pulling against each other, where would consciousness fit in all that stuff? When you look at if you're so
a couple of people in chat have noted something. Wait, where'd it go? Or maybe it's just one person. But yes, so I have never found. So some theist apologists appeal to the continuity of self over time as an argument for the existence of an immaterial soul to ground continuity of identity. So, I'm identical to the person who existed 5 years ago, despite not being identical despite the fact that my body is not identical in those two periods of time. Therefore, there must be some immaterial substance that grounds that. Now, I've never understood that argument, and I don't really see it much in the philosophical literature either. I mean, probably someone's made it, but seems more of an apologist thing. And one of the problems with this argument, as was mentioned, is because there are many other types of entities or objects which also have this issue that we probably don't want to say have souls, right? So the ship of Theseus is a classic example of this, and kind of the canonical example of this problem, where if you gradually replace the parts of the ship of Theseus, and over time, such that after a certain number of years, it no longer has any of the original parts, is it still the same ship, or is it a different ship? Or if so, at what point did it become a new ship? What if you took all the old parts and reassembled them into another ship? Well, is that the original ship? And do you have two ships of Theseus? Is neither of them the original ship? Like, what's going on? Unless you want to say there are such things as ship souls, then it seems like that this problem of identity over time has nothing to do with persons necessarily, and is a broader question of any composite entity. And I've made the argument as well about, apart from just material objects, you can also talk about, planets, or you can talk about political units like the United States of America, like countries. Whole countries have even moved geographical locations over time. The Roman Empire would be a good example of this. And, so do we say that, at what point it become a new country? There seems that there's a lot of continuity. So the point is that this problem is not specific to persons. And so I don't really see why it can be used, it can reasonably be used as an argument for the existence of a soul, because that doesn't solve the problem in any other case, unless you want to say that any composite object has a soul, which seems pretty implausible to me, but I suppose you could go there if you wanted to. Anyway, so I think that this is flawed as an argument, just in principle, even if you kind of accept the premises, because it doesn't, the force of the argument gets you to a soul for humans, but then it leaves open how to solve the problem in all other cases. Whereas I think there are more plausible solutions that don't require postulating a soul and actually solve the problem in other cases as well.
Shrink down too to like the level of an atom and go into a brain, you see that it's not a whole in and of itself. Because another thing that consciousness would require would be a substantial whole, not an aggregate. What's an aggregate? A collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Lego bricks.
Oh, not the Lego. So yeah, when I said composite entity, that's what he's calling an aggregate. So that's it's just a thing that's composed of parts essentially. What's an example of something that's not an aggregate? Well, that depends who you ask. But I would say fundamental particles in physics are not composite entities. Of course, there's a question as to, are there any fundamental particles, or can you keep is it turtles all the way down? That's a separate question. But anyway, so I think he's trying to say here that consciousness would have to be a simple entity with no parts. Let's jump back a second there.
Consciousness would require would be a substantial whole, not an aggregate. What's an aggregate? A collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Lego bricks are aggregates. So if you're just a brain and body, you're just Lego bricks, for lack of a better word, put together. Where would consciousness fit, so to speak, in that? You would need something that is a whole that can unite all your mental properties and states. I can touch on an argument later if you want, further going into that we talked about before the show. So now with AI, here's an interesting thought experiment to kind of switch gears that atheist philosopher John Searle puts forward to argue that AI is not going to be conscious. From a physicalist perspective, and something like strict physicalism is a view that you're a purely physical object with purely physical properties, parts, and substances. Searle said if you're going to do that with, then you're going to have to again make mental properties identical or reducible to the physical. One such mental property is things like intentionality. You're going to have to make intentionality somehow identical or reducible to the physical, or explain it in physical terms if the naturalist wishes to fit this into his ontology of stuff that exists. And one of the attempts was to identify.
So because Eric sucks at doing this, so intentionality, this is a fairly technical term here. Intentionality refers to being about something. So certain systems are said to exhibit intentionality. So, characteristically minds or certain types of minds or mental states more specifically. So, the example would be that when you're thinking about your breakfast this morning, for example, that thought is about like an event that happened. It's about you having breakfast or the breakfast itself. It's sort of directed to something, some object or event or circumstances in the world. You can, of course, think about your own thoughts, and so that then those thoughts are about other thoughts. But intentionality relates, so intentionality is an idea that relates usually thoughts, although it can also be like words or systems of language or something like that, or symbols to other things in the world. And the question is sort of, in virtue of what can we say that something is about something else? So where does intentionality come from? How is it grounded? How do we understand it? It's often raised in the context of philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, because that's where intentionality seems to be relevant. You have these markings on a page in a book, and we want to say that they are about something. They say something, that there's content to them that describes something. They're not mere markings. And the question is sort of, how does that work? How do we understand that? The same thing with verbal language and with thoughts themselves, right? So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about intentionality. It's this being about something, or having like semantic content would be. It's not exactly the same, but it's a related idea. So the question is sort of how to understand that. And it's generally thought that intentionality is difficult to understand in naturalistic terms, which doesn't mean that there aren't many proposals for how to do it, but it has been a hot area of debate in philosophy in the last few decades, and something that I've read a fair bit about as well. In fact, my research sort of relates to this because I study semantics. But anyway, so let's see where this is going. Why bring this
a mental state by its inputs and outputs, its causal roles. So as a substance dualist, which is essentially the view that I am a soul, an immaterial substance with something physical as well. That's, again, just oversimplifying here. Whereas for a physicalist, again, everything's going to have to be either identical, reducible, or explainable by the physical. As a dualist, I would identify mental state by its qualia. What is that? Its intrinsic feeling or texture to it. So if I ask you, how do you know if you're...
Yeah, so qualia is another term in philosophy which refers to the phenomenal aspects of a mental state. So that's what it feels like, what that state feels like, the intrinsic qualities of that experience to the experiencer, to the mind, to whom those mental states belong. So it's the redness of red, or the feeling of touching a texture, or the taste of something, or the raw experience associated often with sensory input, but there's other things as well that have qualia, like pain, for example, or pleasure. Even memory, some people think can have some qualia associated with them, like the feeling of remembering or knowing or understanding something. Some people argue has qualia. But anyway, so that's sometimes called like the raw feeling aspect. Qualia are distinguished from intentionality because one is kind of about meaning and content. That's intentionality. And qualia is about the feeling, experience, subjective aspect. Now, there's a very interesting theory or approach in philosophy of mind, which is known as representational theories of consciousness, or representational theories of qualia, which I'm quite partial to and I've been reading about recently. And basically, the idea here is to say that is to attempt to reduce qualia to intentionality. So phenomenal states are intentional states. So when you experience the redness of red, that's basically a mode of representation of that stimuli that produce the redness. It's a way that's sort of represented in your brain, and that is what the experience. That's what the experience is. It's a particular type of representation. Anyway, that goes a little bit beyond what Eric was talking about here, but I just thought it was interesting to draw a connection between those two ideas, because they are distinct ideas. I'm not entirely sure how Eric is going to connect them. Let's see what I'll try to circle back here and summarize his argument, but it's a bit difficult so far because he just keeps drawing in apparently disconnected ideas. Let's see.
If you're in pain or pleasure, what would your answer be?
Say that again.
How do you know if you're in pain or pleasure?
I introspect on my mental states.
Right. You don't need to plug up to some kind of machine, right?
Yeah.
It's immediate and it's privately accessible to you, and so forth. So we identify mental states by what it is like to be in that kind of a mental state. Mm-hmm. And intentionality is one of those mental states that, again, I don't think can be reduced. So what the attempt was well, let's identify pain as when you get stuck with a pin, you shout ouch. So certain inputs will cause certain outputs, and that's how we can identify the mental state of pain. The problem with that, there's lots of problems, but I mean, inverted qualia could be something where, like, let's say I poke you with a pin, and instead of that causing a mental state of pain, it causes a sensation of tasting banana. But tasting banana also causes you to say ouch. Yet on this reduced perspective of what a pain state is, it would have to follow that you're in pain, even though you're not, you're tasting banana. So here's what sorrow does to kind of show that when it comes to AI. First.
Okay, so, geez. So Eric just skipped over very quickly a very influential argument against. I'm just sort of trying to place it in the context that he's been describing it. I honestly don't know why he was made. I can't quite understand what he was saying it's supposed to be an argument against, but I'll talk about it from what I understand it to be an argument against. So the inverted qualia argument is supposed to be an argument against functionalist explanations of qualia. So, I mean, particularly the theory that I mentioned, representational theories of qualia, although I think it could apply more generally than that. So if you think that something has phenomenal experience because, or in virtue of the fact that it serves a particular functional role, so that means it does something. The example that Eric gave briefly was the idea of pain serving a functional role of, like, it promotes you to withdraw from the aversive stimulus and to form a memory to not do that again, and to cause you to wince, things like that. There's different functional aspects, both internal and external, behavioral and cognitive, associated with that. Probably a whole bunch of others as well that we don't fully understand. So that's sort of the functional side of it. The idea broadly is to say that qualia are functional states. They serve a particular functional role, and they have these sort of, he talked about it as inputs and outputs. Now, the argument against that is, that Eric mentioned, is the inverted qualia argument. Loosely, this is the idea that you could take two different qualia or a bunch of different qualia and kind of flip them over whilst retaining the same function. So this is often advanced in the visual domain. So the idea of inverted qualia is like flip the color spectrum, but keep all of the qualia the same. So basically, my blue is your red, right? And all of the functional roles are the same, except that the phenomenal states underpinning them are different. And the idea is that there'd be no way to tell this, right? Because all of the inputs and outputs, all of the functions are the same. It's just that the phenomenal experience is different. And that's an objection, because the naturalist wants to say that we can understand qualia in terms of the function that they perform. But if there are two different functions, but if there's the same function with two different qualia, then there must be something else that determines which qualia is it. Like, do you get the blue qualia or the red qualia? If the function is the same, it seems underdetermined. And so there must be something else that determines what the qualia is. It can't be the function, right? Because according to this argument, you can have the same function with different qualia. So there must be something else to determine what qualia you get. And, Eric's going to say, I guess it's the soul or something like that. Never mind as to how exactly the soul is supposed to explain that. But I guess, dualists never actually worry about trying to explain how the soul explains anything. They just sort of stick it in as a stopgap between where they think that naturalism fails. But anyway, that's a sort of a side issue. So that's what I understand the inverted qualia argument to be doing. It's trying to serve as an objection to functionalist explanations of qualia, or phenomenal experience. So that's what Eric was mentioning here. But he's now going back to AI. I'm not entirely sure what that has to do with this argument about inverted qualia. I guess he's going to say that the AI can't be conscious because of this, because if an AI is like purely defined in terms of its inputs and outputs, then this sort of inverted qualia argument would also apply. I should probably say something about objections to the inverted qualia argument. So one of them is a sort of a empirical, it's sort of an empirical and a conceptual argument, which is to say that qualia is not actually invertible. So like the visual, the color spectrum as perceived by humans is not invertible because it's asymmetric. Don't ask me to explain exactly how that works, because I find it quite confusing, but you can look that up. It's not perfectly symmetric, so you can't invert it in a simple way. But people try to come up with other examples. So there's debate in the literature about whether these conceptions of whether these ideas of an inverted qualia spectrum or switched around qualia even kind of make sense. I think but whether or not they make sense, I think the physicalist is committed to the idea that you can't have inverted qualia. That is, if the qualia are different, there must be a difference in the underlying physical or functional state, right? So the physicalist, I think, is committed to that, or should be committed to that. And so the response is going to be to say, well, inverted qualia are impossible. And merely whether you can conceive of them or not, which is disputed, they can't actually exist. They're metaphysically impossible, to use a phrase that Eric mentioned before. The literature then consists of trying to give arguments as to why our intuition that there could be inverted qualia are faulty, like trying to explain away different intuition cases about it seems like there could be inverted qualia. So that's sort of one aspect that's discussed. Another thing that I want to point out is I think that there's a problem with these arguments that they think of function in too narrow a way. They often think of it in behavioral terms like wincing or verbal reports or something like that. Now, I agree that you can have the same behavior or very sort of coarse functions with different internal mental states, and including internal qualia. I agree with that, but physicalism isn't committed to some sort of behavioralist reduction of mental states to just like behaviors. To take a crude example, if you ask someone, how are you feeling? They could say good, irrespective of how they're actually feeling inside, right? The report could be the same. And if they're a good actor, maybe their facial expression and body language would be the same as well, right? That's a crude example. But the point is that the functionalist, the physicalist, is going to want to say that it's about things that are happening, functions that are occurring within the brain/mind itself, right? So the types of memories that are being formed, associations, and processing of stimuli in certain ways. So, and a lot of that we don't understand very well because neuroscience is still relatively poorly developed in these sorts of areas. So the point there is, I think that if we're relying on our intuition about what counts as a function and thinking about that in behaviorist terms, then it's going to seem much more plausible that you can just sort of flip around the phenomenal experience and have the same behavior. But I think that we should be more careful in thinking about what function is, because anything that's happening in the brain can count as a function from the point of view of the physicalist. The only things that you can't have is sort of identical brain states with different qualia. That's not going to work because the brain state's supposed to determine what the qualia is. So even if there's similarities between the brain states, as long as there's some differences in terms of a certain aspect of processing or function, then that's enough to ground differences in qualia. And I think that's another important aspect of these inverted qualia arguments as well. Basically, they just appeal to our intuitions, which are not grounded in any actual understanding of the way that the brain and the mind work. And there's a lot of subtlety there that happens often below the level of conscious awareness that we don't even really understand. So what that's going to amount to is that inverted qualia just aren't possible. And if you thought they're invertible, it's probably just you didn't understand what's happening properly. And when you did understand it, it's going to turn out that if you change the function that at some point, then there's going to be a difference in the phenomenal experience. And what the type of argument that Eric gives is really just appealing to intuitions that, well, it seems like you could have the same brain state but with different qualia, but they can't actually show that. And as I've said, there are more specific objections to many alleged possible examples that are given. Anyway, hopefully that's sort of helpful to unpack what he's talking about there.
To say that AI is conscious, I think you're going to have to assume that type of reduced way of identifying mental states of inputs and outputs. In other words, saying AI is consciousness, I think presupposes that you can identify consciousness by its inputs and outputs. Searle says no, that you can't, and he gives what's called the Chinese room argument. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Oh, he's talking about John Searle. He says Searle. I've never heard his name pronounced that. I've always heard him called Searle. But anyway, whatever. Yeah. So the Chinese room argument. I mean, this is sort of related, but he's really jumping around here. So the Chinese room argument is usually given as an objection to naturalistic theories of mental content or of functionalist theories more generally. It's not usually given as an objection to arguments about qualia, or at least that's not how I've seen it, because it's not an argument about phenomenal experience. It's an argument about intentionality or understanding. I really feel like Eric's not being clear about this. I mean, I'm not saying that it has to be a university lecture with all of the different areas demarcated and onto slide 1, slide 2, slide 3 or something like that. But it does help people to understand and be able to learn more about these things if you sort of be a bit clearer about the different argument and the different areas here. I mean, I would say that the inverted qualia argument is quite a different type of argument, or at least it's about a different type of thing to the Chinese room argument, because inverted qualia is really about qualia, phenomenal experience. Chinese room is really about intentionality, understanding mental representations. Now, there is a connection between the two, but they're sort of reasonably distinct issues, and it's confusing me trying to understand the connections he's drawing between them. But what does he want to say about the Chinese?
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard of it, and this is all very interesting. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Alvin Plantinga's.
Oh yeah, I've definitely heard of it. As Cameron hastens to change the topic and start talking about something else that he actually has something to contribute to.
A point in his book, I think it's just called God and Other Minds, where he points out that there really are no good arguments for other minds.
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of what's being brought up in my mind.
If you're a physicalist,
or as you're talking about this.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Because that's even another problem with how do we know anybody's conscious?
Right.
Couldn't there be a possible world in which everything moves and acts the same, and yet there's no consciousness? And I think we call those Z zombies, right? Yeah. So John Searle, the Chinese room argument, for those who aren't familiar, he says, suppose that you put this guy in this room and you lock the door, and there's two slits in this room, and he can't get out. And beside him, there's this rule book, and it says when someone passes in a squiggly squaggly line, you pass out in this other bin that you have, pass out the squaggly squiggly lines. And let's suppose this guy gets so good at this that every time a squiggly squaggly line comes in, he looks at the rule book. Okay, now I pass out a squiggly squiggly, and then all the different variations. He gets so good at this, he doesn't even need the rule book anymore. And now he's just like, as soon as it comes in, he's handing it out. Now, let's also suppose that unbeknownst to him, these lines, squiggly squaggly lines, are questions in Chinese, and what he's passing out are answers in Chinese. Searle's point is that from an outside observer, it looks as if the person inside the room or the room itself is completely fluent in Chinese, and yet the dude doesn't know look at Chinese. He doesn't even know he's doing Chinese. And his point is that you can imitate conscious behavior, but that doesn't follow that such a thing is conscious to begin with. Just like
no. John Searle's point is not about consciousness. I'd have to pull that paper and have a look at it. I don't know if he even talks about that. John Searle is talking about understanding. John Searle's point is that the room, well, according to him, the room and or the man, well, I think originally he says the man doesn't understand Chinese. And then he also says, well, the man plus the room as a whole system also doesn't understand Chinese. Because he says, well, imagine that the man just memorized the whole rule book. Then it's all internal to his mind. But it still seems that he doesn't understand Chinese. It's just sort of processing symbols, like a Turing machine, as someone's mentioned in chat. That's John Searle's whole point, that he's saying that computation isn't sufficient for understanding. By giving this as an example. Now, there have been a huge swath of responses to this. It's something, I think it's quite a compelling argument. I ultimately disagree, but I think that there's a kernel to the argument. Maybe I'll talk more about what I think about that in a moment. But at the moment, I'm trying to focus on what Eric's trying to get out of it, because I don't think that this argument, the Chinese room argument, says much of anything about consciousness. I mean, I suppose that if you want to... So for someone like me who leans towards a representational theory of phenomenal consciousness, then we're going to say that phenomenal consciousness is reducible to intentionality. And then if we want to say that intentionality is reducible to like Turing computation, like processing symbols, inputs and outputs, then maybe this argument would work, because it's going to say, well, no, like, this sort of computation symbol manipulation isn't sufficient for actually understanding. It's not sufficient for intentionality, and therefore, your reduction of phenomenal consciousness through intentionality to a physical state is not going to work. But I mean, that's a very specific line of argument there, and you don't have to pursue that particular line. Like, there are other approaches to consciousness that don't appeal to representational theories. Plus, I'm the one who's been talking about that. Eric hasn't said anything about representational theories of consciousness, so I don't know that that's what he's getting at. It feels like he's just sort of conflating two related but distinct issues here.
You can imitate being fluent in Chinese doesn't make you fluent in Chinese. A computer, artificial intelligence imitating conscious behavior doesn't prove that it is therefore conscious. And I think that saying something is conscious would have to assume that type of reduced view of identifying mental states by inputs and outputs.
Yeah, I think I like that argument, because well, it kind of puts the perspective back on, like, we've got to establish what is consciousness in the first place.
That's right.
I mean, because we kind of know that, I mean, all of our experiences are based in a being that is conscious. So we know what it's like, but then, how do you actually go out and test something like AI? Because there's a whole lot of videos, and like, I think there was some, now I'm not going to remember correctly, but there was some like Google, someone at Google was claiming that their AI had started to say that it was sentient or conscious or something like that. And then, like, what do you do if an AI does start to say something like that? Can you trust it? And so I think it, because what you're kind of pointing out here with the Chinese room experiment is that just because something is giving you the right input output, that does not mean that it's conscious. Right. And so then it's just going to come back to the arguments for how anything can be conscious in the first place.
Yep.
And then if your argument is successful, that you need a soul in order to ground consciousness, then that's what you're going to need in order to show that something like AI is going to be conscious in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
Eric hasn't given any argument that a soul is necessary to ground consciousness. He did argue that a soul is necessary to ground personal identity over time. We talked about that already. But he hasn't said anything about the relationship between souls and consciousness. All he said is that the material is insufficient for consciousness. And we had the indiscernibility of identicals argument, which I think was not very well articulated. We had the inverted spectrum argument, which was also not very well articulated in my opinion. And then we had the Chinese room argument, which was articulated okay, but seemed to have been misapplied, because it's not really an argument against phenomenal consciousness. It's an argument against explaining intentionality or understanding in terms of intentionality and understanding aren't exactly the same thing either, but they're close enough for our purposes here. Reducing intentionality or understanding to functional inputs and outputs, like computation. It's supposed to be an argument against the computational theory of mind. That's what it's directed to. So it is relevant to artificial intelligence. But note that as far as I know, John Searle is a physicalist. He just thinks that, as far as I understand, John Searle thinks that neurons, or brains more generally, have peculiar or particular causal powers which enable them to produce, generate, give rise to consciousness in a way that like silicon-based computers can't. And he doesn't think that that these causal powers that they have are explicable or reducible to computation. So John Searle is arguing against computation as the explanation of what, and when I say computation, it's just symbol manipulation, like Eric was describing. Someone gives you a bunch of symbols and some instructions for what to do with them, and you process them, and you hand your paper back in. There's no idea that you have to like understand or have any kind of particular mental representation of what you're doing, or you can like generalize it to some other task or whatever. It's purely just you follow the instructions, and that's all there is to it. That's what is meant by computation in this context here. So John Searle's arguing against computational theory of mind. He's not arguing against physicalism, unless you think that the only viable form of physicalism is a form of computationalism. And so, again, I think Eric is a bit confused here. I don't think the Chinese room argument is an argument against physicalism, at least not without a whole bunch of extra assumptions here. And I think he should be more careful in articulating this if he's going to use it as that argument. But irrespective of those three arguments, none of those is an argument for dualism. At best, they're arguments against a materialist theory of mind, although, as I've argued, not very good ones and not very well articulated here. But at best, they're an argument against physicalism. That doesn't automatically get you to dualism, because there are other options. Eric already mentioned one of them, which is panpsychism. Another option is property dualism, which is distinct from substance dualism. It says that there are mental properties which are not reducible to physical substances or properties, but that there's no mental substance, but there are mental properties that are irreducible. And that's a whole difficult debate about to articulate exactly what that's supposed to mean. I find it difficult to understand, and I think other philosophers too as well, is to articulate how there are mental properties which don't reduce to physical properties, but are nevertheless distinct from any physical properties themselves. But that's another option. So there are also types of, I should also mention, there are types of substance dualism that reject the notion of souls. So they think that there's some kind of immaterial substance, but they wouldn't use the language of souls. They're not Cartesian dualists, in other words. And again, I'm not sure I'd be able to articulate exactly how that works, but that's a view that's held as well. You could also be an eliminativist about consciousness, to say that there is no such thing as consciousness. Daniel Dennett is more or less in that category, although he doesn't always accept that label. But the point is, there are other options here, right? As usual, and the apologist is sort of proceeding by, well, it's either A or B, and it's not A, therefore it must be B. So you cannot kind of get away with arguing for what you want without actually giving any arguments for it, just presenting this false dichotomy, which I think is really lame.
So by implication, again, given that thoughts have thinkers, the thinker would be the soul, and then your thought would be the mental states and properties. So in other words, if you're going to say that a physical machine is conscious, then you're going to have to ask what possesses that. Is it this part over here or this part over here? Now, note though, this is saying that consciousness is not identical or reducible to the physical is not to say that there are no correlations or cause and effect relations or dependence relations. Moreland says something like, fire causes smoke, but it doesn't prove that smoke and fire are the same thing. I've often used like a guitar illustration or with an instrument that, these certain keys on a piano cause a note C, but they're not reducible to each other. So just because there's a cause effect doesn't mean they're the same thing. In fact, I don't know if
this is very difficult to listen to. Maybe you don't pick up these things, but as someone who actually spends time reading philosophy of mind and trying to make sense of some of these debates, Eric is so sloppy in the way that he's using language here. He talks about things not being the same and says, and sort of uses that interchangeably with being reducible to something. But those are different, right? So things could be this. If A is the same as B, then A is not reducible to B because they're the same. You don't reduce something to itself. That doesn't make sense. Reducible to the notion of reduction presupposes that there are two different things. That's why I was talking about before, right? The idea of the brain and mind being identical is different to the idea of the brain being, or the mind being reducible to the brain. You can't reduce A to itself. That doesn't make any sense. You have to reduce something to something that's different from itself. And so the point is, he's not making these distinctions that are pretty critical to these arguments. Most physicalists are going to say that in some sense, the mind is different from the brain, even if in a purely semantic sense. Not necessarily that it's a different substance, but just that there's sort of difference in the way that we talk about it or the language about it. Maybe they'll say there are mental properties that are distinct from physical properties. I think that's substance dualism, but honestly, I'm not even sure because, I think that's property dualism, but I'm not 100% sure because that term is very difficult to pin down. But anyway, the point is that, because there are also people who call themselves physicalists, but they're called non-reductive physicalists. The philosopher that was mentioned before, Jaegwon Kim, he's a famous philosopher who argues against the coherence of this notion of non-reductive physicalism. I sort of tend to lean towards these arguments myself, but anyway, we're getting a bit out of focus here. The point is that these distinctions matter a lot, and Eric isn't being clear about them. He's just moving between one way of describing things and another way of describing things, where the whole argument could hinge on what conception you have of the relationship between the mental and the physical, and we're not getting that clarity here.
Any dualist that would deny cause and effect relations like that. And I bring that up to say, if a computer is conscious, again, not just saying that these parts of the computer are associated with this kind of programming, where are those thoughts and what grounds those thoughts? And that's why I say, well, then you would need to have some kind of a soul, but where would you put that thing, so to speak? And even
where would you put that thing? I mean, where does the soul go in a human? Like, this is one of the objections to the notion of a soul. Like, it seems that it's supposed to exist in the physical world because it's associated with a particular body. So where is it? I mean, is it at the pituitary gland, like apparently Descartes thought? Like, where is it? I mean, is it in your nose? Is it kind of at the back of your head? Like, is it associated with a particular part of the brain? Like, how do we understand that? The whole thing seems like nonsense, to be honest. It doesn't cohere with anything we understand about the physical world. So if that's a problem for the artificial intelligence, why is it not also a problem for souls in associated with human bodies? I mean, and the other thing that he mentioned in terms of like what did he say? Where does the thought come from, or something like that? Or how does the thought arise from the the state in the let me jump back a bit. I want to get his exact language on this.
If a computer is conscious, again, not just saying that these parts of the computer are associated with this kind of programming, where are those thoughts and what grounds those thoughts?
Yeah, what grounds those thoughts? Well, I mean, the thoughts are, insofar as they're anywhere, they're in the computer. I mean, where are your thoughts? Well, they're in your head, I guess, like in your brain. As far as we can say they're anywhere, that's where they are. So, although not all physical things have a location, this is very important, right? So a good example of this is the economy, right? Unless you want to say the economy is just some sort of collective delusion, which is an interesting take, but I think not very plausible. The economy is real, and it's not some unless you're a dualist about the economy, it's just made up of physical bits, but you can't point to where it is. Like, where is the economy? Well, I don't know. It's sort of wherever people are engaging in transactions. Where is the government, right? Like, it's not like it's in one building somewhere. It's distributed throughout, the country. It's a classic example of a category error. It's like, well, where are the thoughts? Well, I mean, I guess they're sort of in your head, but they don't really have a precise location. That's the wrong language to talk about them. It's not like there's one neuron that is that thought and this neuron's the other thought. They're distributed over your, as far as we know, widely distributed over your cortex, and maybe subcortical regions as well. Who knows? And similarly, if a computer was conscious, I mean, I don't think they are now, but maybe at some point they will be. If it was, then its thoughts would be distributed in its processor, I assume. I don't know how it would work exactly. Maybe it would be designed differently. So, but I mean, I don't know what the issue is supposed to be here. If the concern is that every physical entity must have a precise location, but thoughts don't have a precise location, therefore they can't be physical. Well, that's just a nonsense premise, right? Every physical thing doesn't have to have a precise location. There's lots of physical things that are spread out or only sort of vaguely localized. It's sort of hard to say where they are precisely just because they're at a very high level of abstraction. Like, where is the weather? Well, I mean, it's sort of in the atmosphere, right? But you can't say precisely where it is in the atmosphere. I mean, where does the storm end? It's not like that there's a point that sort of maps out precisely where it ends and what parts of the atmosphere are part of a storm and which aren't. This notion that something is physical has to be localizable to a particular region is just nonsense, right? So I don't know how this is supposed to be an objection to physicalism, whether it's of the AI mind or of the human mind or any other type of mind. I just think it's a dumb objection.
Some kind of a soul, but where would you put that thing, so to speak? And even suffice to say that if you don't have something in the base properties, or at least some indication that this thing's nature has the ultimate capacity to possess these ultimate capacities like consciousness, you have no reason to believe that it's going to be consciousness. So if we, at best, someone can say, well, perhaps a soul could emerge from this. And I think that gets into other problems because I think, I don't know if it was Nagel or Jaegwon Kim that basically argue, and you even mentioned Rasmussen says something like this, you're not going to get some, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, sui generis. You know how to pronounce that word? Sui generis?
I think that's
sui generis. You're not going to get some totally radically different kind of property emerging from things that are unlike the subvenient base. What at best you're going to get are what are called structural properties. So throw some wooden boards together. These 10 wooden boards have the property of being a pile of wooden boards. What I can do is I can rearrange those, and then now I have a raft. And now the same base parts can now have the property of being a raft. But note, it's not a new kind of entity. It's just a new pattern and configuration that gives it a new structural property, not a sui generis, totally different property. So take the physical stuff, even computer hardware, whatever. If there is no consciousness there to begin with, and Plantinga gives a similar argument when it comes to the brain, but if there's no consciousness there to begin with, how are you going to rearrange Lego bricks, if you will?
Yeah.
And then boom, consciousness pops into existence. Plantinga.
Because it's a structural property. It's a functional property. Like, I don't understand. It's like the physical... It should be so obvious to his understanding. I mean, it doesn't mean he has to agree with the argument, but he should understand what the physicalist is going to say to this. the physicalist is going to say that consciousness just is a structural / relational / functional property. It's not this sui generis type of new entity. He thinks it's that, but the physicalist doesn't think it's that. So it's ridiculous to argue against the physicalist by saying, well, the AI can't be conscious because it's not going to give rise to a sui generis type of entity which is needed for consciousness, because the physicalist doesn't think that that's needed for consciousness. So you have to argue against the idea that that's what you have to argue. Well, Eric would have to argue that that is what's necessary for consciousness, is some sort of special new type of substance. Now, we haven't got any argument for that. The only thing he's presented us is, in my view, badly articulated forms of arguments against physicalism about the mind. But that doesn't get you to the idea that consciousness is or is caused by or whatever a sui generis, special new type of substance. We've got zero arguments for that whatever, and we're not even really told how that would work, let alone be given an argument for it. So this whole argument he's giving here is sort of entirely misconstrued. Like, not only is he arguing against a straw man, because physicalists aren't going to say that there needs to be a sui generis type of entity, but he hasn't even given us what his version of his side of the argument would be. He's just sort of made vague references to it.
Says something like, take a look at the brain. It's an aggregate. Let's look at the very base, like an atom or quark or lepton, whatever the lowest is. Is that conscious? No. Okay. Throw together 1 million of those, and then you get an atom. Is that conscious? No. Throw a few million, however many it takes. Then you get a cell. Eventually you get a brain. At what point is consciousness going to pop into this bad boy?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what some people at this point are going to say is, well, that's
wait, I think he's going to say what I was going to say.
The fallacy of composition.
Yeah,
is often the accusation. If we could see the chat, I guarantee you there's someone in there shouting that as well. What's the fallacy of composition? It's the accusation that I'm saying that because
a property doesn't exist in the parts, it doesn't exist in the whole.
Right, exactly. Now, the problem with that kind of accusation is that, first of all, it's a case-by-case basis. Because if I took 100 red bricks and constructed a small house, then yes, the property of these bricks being red will also entail that the whole house is going to be red, all things being equal. So it's a fallacy of composition is a case-by-case basis. But what I'm arguing is more like, you're not going to take a whole bunch of red bricks, rearrange them, and get the color blue from a mere structural rearrangement. So at best, all you're going to get are structural properties, not sui generis, different kind of properties like consciousness. So then the burden of proof is on the person, proposing that AI can be conscious, to show, one, how can this happen metaphysically? What indications do you have that these physical states have the ultimate capacity within their nature to even possess consciousness? How do you define or identify a mental state? Because again, if you're going to go to inputs and outputs, we just go back to what Sarl's saying. And it's not a fallacy of composition, because we're not talking about, it's a case by case. And on top of that, the fallacy of composition has to do with something like, if I'm not mistaken, called property transfer. Because I'm not saying that this thing has property X and it's going to be transferred into the bigger thing. I think there are cases like that. But note, saying that a quark or cell or atom is not conscious, I'm not saying that an atom possesses not consciousness and that property of not consciousness passes on into the bigger thing of it being not conscious, because negative properties don't exist. I'm not a bear, but I don't possess a property of not being a bear. You don't have negative properties. So even then, I'm not saying that not consciousness is a property that's going to be passed on to everything else. I'm saying we have no reason to believe it, and the burden of proof would be on the other person to show that we would expect consciousness to exist.
Oh, geez, he blathers on and doesn't say anything. Okay, so that last couple of sentences there was really the substance of his response there. So this is classic apologetics, shifting the burden of proof, right? So remember, he was giving an argument as to why an AI wouldn't be conscious. And the argument was, well, the component parts of it, well, I think it was broader than that. I think it's any physical system couldn't be conscious. Again, it's hard to tell with Eric because he's often very unclear. But he was giving an argument as to why an AI or maybe any physical system can't be conscious. And the argument was, well, the constituent parts of physical entities aren't conscious, like atoms and subatomic particles, and then atoms, and then cells, like molecules, and then cells, and then so forth. And so the point is, at what point does consciousness emerge? It doesn't seem like it can emerge at any particular point. So therefore, I guess the consciousness can't arise or be the product purely of physical parts. I think that was what the argument was saying. Now, the obvious objection to that is that's just a fallacy of composition. Just because the parts don't possess the property doesn't mean the whole can't. And that's combined with the fallacy of, it's combined with the paradox of the heap, right? So you take a heap of grains of sand and you take one away. Is it still a heap? Well, yeah, I mean, there's probably millions of grains of sand, and a million minus one, that's still a heap, right? Okay, well, you keep taking away one. At some point, you've got one grain of sand, which is a heap, and then you take that away, and presumably 0 grains of sand isn't a heap. Now, that seems a bit wrong, right? It doesn't seem like 1 grain of sand is a heap, but then, well, is 2? No. Well, is 3? Probably not. Is 100? Well, maybe. So at what point did it become a heap? Right. So this is related to vagueness. I mean, Eric thinks of consciousness as a special and unitary singular kind of, well, entity, substance, I guess. And therefore, it doesn't make sense for him to talk about it as sort of gradually emerging from smaller components or something like that. But that's what the physicalist is going to say. So Eric needs to address the physicalist on their own terms. He needs to say why the physicalist conception is wrong. What Eric is actually doing, it seems to me, is saying why he can't. What Eric is doing is saying that he can't make sense of his model of consciousness on physicalist terms. Well, of course he can't, because the physicalist can't make room for this notion of a sui generis special substance, unitary substance that's not reducible to anything. Yes, of course, that doesn't make sense under physicalism, but physicalists don't believe in that, Eric. You need to argue against what the physicalists believe, not what you believe somehow wedged into a physicalist framework. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. What the physicalist is going to say is that just because the individual components aren't conscious doesn't mean the whole thing together can't be conscious. That's as dumb as saying that because an atom isn't alive, therefore a combination of atoms can't be alive, like a cell. That's just idiotic, and no one should argue with that. To say that, well, it's not a fallacy of composition because it's a case-by-case basis is not a response. You have to argue, if you're going to say sometimes it is a fallacy and sometimes it isn't, then you can't make that argument. You have to say, why is it in this particular case you can't, there can't be building blocks that are not conscious, but an aggregate of those building blocks that is conscious, right? That's what the physicalist thinks. Eric is saying there can't be. We need an explanation as to why, because we both agree, both Eric and I agree, that there are cases when the fact that the units, the building blocks don't have a property does not entail that the combination of those also doesn't have a property. So you can't just appeal to the general idea that the lower bits don't, so therefore the whole bit doesn't. So you need a more specific argument as to why this is a case where the lower bits not having the property does mean that the composite also doesn't have that property. We need an explanation as to why it applies in this particular case. And Eric hasn't given one. His response is just to say, oh, well, the burden of proof is on you to show that it isn't. Well, hang on. It depends who's making the argument. If the physicalist is going to say that so-and-so system is conscious, then yeah, they need to give an argument as to why they think that it is. But I mean, I think that they have plausible arguments to give there, at least about humans. Maybe AI is a bit trickier. But you can't just respond to the question, could an AI be conscious, by saying, well, it can't be because it's on the physicalist to prove that it would be. Like, that's just not an argument. At best, that's saying, at best you could interpret that as him saying that he doesn't think that it would be, and the physicalist would need to provide good evidence as to why we should think that it is. And that's sort of fair enough. But he seemed to be using it as an argument against the idea that it could even in principle be consciousness. But then all it really amounted to is saying, is shifting the burden of proof to the physicalist. But because remember, he had no argument as to why just because the components aren't conscious, that therefore the whole thing can't be conscious. He made an argument as if he was appealing to the fallacy of composition. And then he acknowledged that is a fallacy, but kind of said, but it's okay because sometimes it applies. That's not how arguments work, Eric. You have to show that in this particular case, that reasoning goes through. If it sometimes applies and sometimes doesn't, why does it apply in this particular case? You can't just respond by saying, well, the physicalist has to show that it doesn't. But you're the one making the argument, Eric, that it's impossible in principle for AIs to be conscious. You bear the burden of proof, not the physicalist. If the physicalist is claiming something, then they bear the burden of proof. But here you're making the claim. You, Eric, bear the burden of proof. You can't just shift it off onto the physicalist. That's disingenuous.
Yeah, Rasmussen, I haven't got to that part of the book. I'm only in the first, I don't know, 30, 40 pages so far. But toward the end of the book, he's been mentioning at the beginning that he's going to eventually provide all these different construction problems that arise out of trying to construct consciousness out of these sort of more fundamental building blocks, right? And how it just seems really impossible. It's not just a matter of like, oh, this is unlikely. No, it's more like, yeah, you can't take different particles of dust, arrange them brain-wise, and then expect consciousness to just emerge from that, because it's the wrong type of material. And then the
What do you mean it's the wrong type of material? What type of material? Oh, I would love an answer to this question. What type of material is the right type of material to make consciousness out of? This is an objection to substance dualism that is mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia article about it, but doesn't seem to get a lot of attention in the literature. At least I've not encountered it too much. I'm trying to read a bit more about it. But the objection is essentially saying, okay, let's suppose that, let's take this idea of a soul or an immaterial mind seriously. Substance dualism says that the mind is a substance, right? What substance is it? What is it made of? Or what properties does it have? Like, what can we say about it as a substance? And there are a couple of possible views here, but most of them don't make a whole lot of sense. Like, one of them is the so-called ectoplasm view, which is the idea that, well, it's some kind of substance that's not physical, but it's just kind of its own thing, like, I don't know, ectoplasm, which is some kind of like ghostly non-physical substance, but has its own kind of set of properties. That doesn't really seem to work, because all of the arguments that you're going to run against physicalism, you could just also run against immaterial. Like, I don't know, imagine atoms were just immaterial, but they still had the building block component, like, aspects to it. All the same arguments can apply there. So it doesn't really seem like this kind of ectoplasm view works. And I don't know that anyone actually argues for that. There's another view, which I think is the most common view, which is to simply say, well, the immaterial substance of the mind isn't made of anything. It just sort of is. Like that's kind of the argument. And this is just an abdication of intellectual responsibility, as far as I'm concerned. It just says, well, the mind as a whole is just this special thing that isn't made of anything, and we can't say anything about it apart from the fact that it is a mind, or it gives rise to the mind, or whatever. It's just utter nonsense and hot air, as far as I'm concerned. That the point is, it's not just that substantialists say that the mind is an immaterial substance. They can't actually say anything about what that substance is, or what properties it has, apart from those that it needs to have to explain the mind. So everything that we can say about it is purely stipulated in order to account for the known phenomena that we're trying to account for. Note that that's not the case for physicalism. It's not like that physicalists just made up neurons and glial cells and action potentials and all of that stuff to account for the specific properties that we're trying to account for. These are things that we discovered, and we then link up the idea that, action potentials traveling across neural networks can carry information, and that information can be processed in neural networks, which can implement functions, and then we can simulate that on a computer and show how that can explain learning and processing of information, decision making, and reinforcement signals, and blah blah blah, all of this cool stuff, right? I'm not saying that we're all the way there yet, but we certainly have a lot of pieces, and those haven't been predefined just to account for the phenomena in question. So this isn't true of physicalism. It's uniquely true of substance dualism, and I think similar views, which they have nothing to say whatever about anything other than what's stipulated just to account for the thing they're trying to explain, like the mind. So I think this is an embarrassment of these sorts of views. And then to say that, well, there's some sort of to have the gall to then say, well, atoms are the wrong type of stuff to make up minds, as if the substance dualist has any other alternative available other than it's this soul thingy that we can't say anything about, but trust us, it does the job because we defined it that way. As if that is a credible alternative. That's just absolutely laughable to me. And again, I think that this objection completely misunderstands the physicalist view, or at least most of the physicalist views, which is that it doesn't matter what a mind is made of. What matters is it doesn't matter what the building blocks are. What matters is how they're connected and how they're arranged and how they function. This is the idea of, if we think of the mind as computation, or at least that's a big aspect of what's happening, you can implement a computer using many different mechanisms. A famous argument is that you could build, I think Searle might have made this argument as well. You could build a computer out of water pipes that were connected up in the right way, that could implement logic gates and therefore be used to construct a digital computer. Whether or not a water pipe's brain could actually be conscious is an interesting question. It may depend on how it's implemented and a bunch of other things, because it may depend on the time of processing and how long it takes and things like that. But anyway, that's a deeper issue. But the point is that the physicalist is going to say that it's not fundamentally about the fact that a brain is made of neurons or carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms that's important. It's about the functions that it implements. And we understand this fairly readily. Like, you can make, I don't know, a fork. You can make a fork out of metal. You could also make it out of ceramics or plastic. It's still a fork, right? Because what defines it as a fork is its shape and its functionality and how it's used. It's not the material that it's made of. I don't understand how someone who's older than, 6 years of age can't understand this point, that it's not always about the substance that something is made of. It's about its form and its functionality that determines that the properties in question. Now, that's not true for everything. Sometimes it is what it's made of, but the objection here is that brains are made of the wrong stuff to give rise to minds. But the whole point is that pretty much any physicalist is going to say, yeah, but it matters how the building blocks are fitted together. It's not so much what the blocks are made of. I mean, in our brains, they happen to be made of, mostly carbon and oxygen and hydrogen atoms, but that's not critical to any of the accounts that we're going to give about the connection between brains and minds. It's just that's what we happen to use. And somehow it seems that at least some of these substance dualists are back at the level of, but it's made of something different. And so if it's made of something different, then it can't give rise to the same thing. By the way, how does this objection work under their own view? Does this mean that God could not make I don't know, like a crystalline entity from Star Trek that's made of silicon. It's like a silicon crystal. Is it possible for God to make that conscious by imbuing it with a soul, assuming it had the right, configuration, I suppose, to support that? Like, it almost seems like they're saying that there's something metaphysically special about. Maybe John Searle even says something like this. I'm not quite sure how far he goes with this. There's something metaphysically special about neurons and a carbon-based biochemistry or something that's uniquely causally allows them to be conscious. I don't know why we would say this or what that has to do with dualism, but if that's not true, notice that if we reject that and they say, well, yeah, God could give a soul to a crystalline entity or even a computer if he wanted to, right? Well, then this whole argument falls apart because it doesn't matter what it's made of. What matters for their point of view is, does it have a soul or not? It's irrelevant whether it's made of carbon or silicon or, I don't know, water pipes or something else, right? Now, the physicalist is going to say something similar, except it's not about whether it has a soul from the physicalist point of view. It's about its functionality and whether it implements certain functional relations and so forth. So on either point of view, it actually seems irrelevant what the actual brain or substrate of the mind is made of. What matters is either does it have a soul or does it implement the right kind of functional relations? And so this really seems like it's this sort of 5-year-old mentality of like I don't even know why. I don't even know if children think like that actually, but it's sort of like, well, if it's made of something different, then that's the only thing that matters. It's like the only thing that matters is the ingredients. It's like making a cake. The only thing that matters is the ingredients and like the way you mix them and their ratios and the way you cook it and everything. That's irrelevant. It's only the ingredients. Like the rawmost ingredients. I don't understand why anyone would think that. It's such a bizarre view. And like no one actually thinks like this in other contexts. But somehow Josh Rasmussen thinks this is a serious argument against physicalism about the mind. I don't get it at all.
Question is, well, what type of material do you need? And then it kind of goes back to like, well, maybe you need something like a soul or something that already has consciousness, kind of like what you've been saying. There was something else I kind of wanted to come back to. So one of the things that you said in response to AI being conscious is that it's going to be really difficult to actually determine or come to some like reasonable conclusion that it is conscious. There's just no really good test. We can't.
Got some good contributions in chat here, which I want to draw out here. When trying to critique a view, it seems very common to critique a combination of one's own view and the other view. Craig does this a lot. Yes, I agree. That is a very common. I mean, I think it's common probably of everyone. It's especially common of apologists. What they do is they'll take one aspect, they'll take their worldview and replace one aspect of it by some aspect of a view they're trying to critique, and they'll show that the result doesn't make any sense. And that's just because they're not actually making an effort to critique the other view. They're just critiquing a bit of the view sandwiched into their own view, which is an absurd hybrid that no one's going to adopt. And I think that that's what we saw here with this idea that, well, under physicalism, you can't explain how this sui generis, unified, non-composite substance could emerge from somewhere. Well, yeah, that's because physicalists don't believe in that. So why are we talking about this? So I thought that was a good point. Camille is here with nothing to contribute. So thanks, Camille, for contributing nothing. I'm not entirely sure how serious this comment was intended, but I sort of think it's a good point in a sense. Like, consciousness is made of God particles. Prove to me that God particles don't exist. This is the point, right? Like, we could invoke all sorts of weird and wonderful solutions if we wanted to. We could say that there's these kind of weird particles that come together in a funny way to give rise to consciousness, and they're not really physical. They're something different or whatever. And I mean, what does Eric have to say about that? Like, any of his objections we could get around by saying, oh, it has this special property of giving rise to consciousness, right? So it just sort of does that. And it doesn't do it through, I don't know, functional means. It does through special God particle, sui generis causal powers or whatever. Like, you can always just ad hoc whatever nonsense you want if you're going to build in the things that you're trying to explain. And this is why I think substance dualism is such a pathetic intellectual endeavor, because it has nothing to contribute. It doesn't actually say anything other than what is already trying to what we're trying to explain is mental faculties like consciousness and intentionality and qualia and things like this, and decision making and things like that. And it explains those by saying there's this special substance which just exists and isn't describable in terms of anything else, and it just sort of has these special causal powers. And somehow it interacts with the physical, but not in a way that we can articulate. Like, what is that? That's not an answer. You've just redescribed the problem using more annoying sounding terms. Like, I just have no respect for I have no respect for philosophical programs that do that sort of thing. And it's not only dualists who do that, by the way, but that's, I think, what we see mostly in the philosophy of mind space. So yeah, I think that's in a sense a good point. I think we had something else here. Yes, this point here. Theoretically, you could replace a part of the brain with a microchip and have the person remain conscious, but that's the wrong material. Yeah, so this is actually this is actually an argument that's given in favor of physicalism, which is that it seems that you could imagine taking out a single neuron from your brain and replacing it with a microchip that has the exact same functional behavior as that neuron. So it interacts with the surrounding cells in the same way and delivers the same electrical potentials. And I guess it would need to produce neurotransmitters and things. But it does all of that stuff in the same way that the neuron did, except it's not a neuron, it's a microchip. And the idea would be, well, we wouldn't expect anyone to notice any difference. We would expect the brain just to keep going as it is, right? And okay, well, we do that with one neuron. What about two? What about three? And the point is, well, theoretically, why couldn't you just replace all of them with microchips? And again, theoretically, function will be preserved, right? Because each of the components is doing the same thing. This is obviously a thought experiment, so it's not like you can prove that would be the case. I personally think that, at least theoretically, that could be possible, that you could replace a brain with synthetic components that did the same thing. In practice, it would be extremely difficult to do that for a bunch of reasons. But so that is an argument that's given in favor of physicalism. And I think that there is some validity to that line of thinking there. But it also goes to show that these sort of arguments can be made either way. Like Eric is saying, well, how many neurons does it take before it becomes conscious? Well, you can just think of it the other way. How many neurons do we have to take away before it ceases being conscious, and replacing them with that microchip? And that seems to lead you to the exact opposite conclusion. So, obviously does give right. It does go to show, I think, how these sort of thought experiments are not always entirely reliable, but the devil does depend on the details there. But I wanted to highlight that because I think that is an important point. All right, let's keep going here.
And go in ourselves and experience consciousness on their behalf or anything like that. Right. So how do you actually do it? So that's one concern, one worry about actually identifying it.
The problem of other minds.
Yeah. Right. And then, but then the separate question is, do your arguments for dualism actually work? Right? Is there reason to think that we've got to appeal to a soul in order to account for conscious states? Because if we don't,
that's what I was saying.
Then maybe we could just be like, okay, maybe we can't particularly identify when something is conscious or not, sure, but it's at least possible, right? Because this person would be sort of rejecting your arguments for dualism. One option that came to mind, Rasmussen has mentioned it, I think, at the very beginning chapters. What is it called? It's not emergentism. Eliminativism. Huh? So someone could just deny that they have thoughts that can be true or false, and so it's not that you have this thing that has this property and this thing that doesn't have this property, and so you've got a disconnect and they're not identical. Rather, what the eliminativist does is they just literally eliminate our consciousness.
Yeah.
So what about that option?
Yeah.
I think one of the problems with Cameron is that he seems to only read apologists, or I guess probably theologians as well. Why not just pick up a good book on philosophy of mind? For example, Jaegwon Kim was mentioned, and I have his book. Yeah, here we go. This is an older edition, but it checks out. Jaegwon Kim, Philosophy of Mind. This is a well-written and fairly simple, as far as these things go, introduction to philosophy of mind. It goes through all of the key issues. It's only 350-ish pages. So we've got chapters on what is philosophy of mind, Cartesian dualism, behaviorism, identity theory, machine functionalism, causal theoretical functionalism, which is more what I would lean towards, and then the some specific issues about mental causation, mental content, so that's intentionality, consciousness, and then qualia specifically. There's sort of two chapters on consciousness. Personally, I think there probably should be a single one. But anyway, it's sort of all the core issues and core debates there in a fairly readable, accessible package. I'd strongly recommend this. Why doesn't Cameron read books like that? It wouldn't take that long. You could read that in a few days, even with time to think about it. Instead of reading these just terrible books by apologists that only present their narrow version of things, which don't seem to be very well informed by my point of view. I mean, Jaegwon Kim is a physicalist, right? He has his own point of view here, but it's still a fairly well balanced and written book. It's not a polemic, right? I don't understand. It's like many apologists seem to, and popularizers as well, they just only seem to read apologetics. They just don't read much, if any, mainstream philosophy. There's a lot of good books out there. Just read some good philosophy. Crack open Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and read up on different opinions. At least you'll have a broader range of knowledge to appeal to and understand a bit better about different viewpoints instead of only seeing everything through one lens. It just really annoys me that there's a pretense of scholarship and learning here, but it all seems to come from a very sort of narrow range of viewpoints and all focused on kind of how can we use this to defend Christianity instead of just learning for learning's sake and trying to understand things. Anyway, that's my little rant there. This sort of thing just annoys me.
So I would think that they would be biting the bullet, and then so by default, AI can't be consciousness because there is no consciousness. It just doesn't exist. So they would actually be on my side in this case. Frank Jackson, he basically argues that if a naturalist is going to be consistent, he's going to have to when he finds a quote problematic entity, he has two options. He can either reduce it and make it, and I'm paraphrasing here, like reduce it or make it identical to the physical or something like that, or he has to eliminate them from his ontology. And some philosophers have gone that route. Like Alex Rosenberg, he'll say he doesn't have any beliefs, and you just have to ask him if he believes that, right? So to deny consciousness,
I don't understand how. I need to read more about Rosenberg's views, but I think he rejects. I think he rejects folk psychological terms, so belief is going to be one of those. But okay, so Alex Rosenberg says that there are no such things as beliefs, and you ask him, "Do you believe that?" What do you think he's going to say? Of course, he's going to say, "Well, no," right? Because there are no such things as belief. I mean, he'd probably say something like, "Well, in an everyday sense, you might say that you believe it, but that's just because our everyday language is sort of sloppy and not well grounded." Like we might say the sun rises, right? Well, does it actually rise? Well, no, like the Earth's rotating. So it's not really true that the sun rises, but it's just a figure of speech, right? So he might say something like that. As a figure of speech, he has beliefs, but he doesn't really have beliefs, not in a rigorous philosophical sense. And that's a perfectly coherent view. And I personally don't agree. I think that we can give reasonable naturalistic accounts of beliefs. I don't know exactly what his arguments against that are. I need to read more about that. But the point is that this sort of offhanded, "Oh, we do believe that." What's he going to say? Like, well, obviously, in at least in a philosophical sense, no, he doesn't believe that because he doesn't think beliefs exist. What's the problem here? Like, there's no whatever account he's going to give of everyday discourse of beliefs is not going to include an appeal to beliefs as an actual kind of like ontological real category. He's going to eliminate them. So he's going to give some other account as to our belief discourse. This idea that a discourse can't be used because it is ultimately non-referring, it is just kind of stupid. Like, another example of this, here's a good example. Sometimes I've heard, maybe not apologists, but Christians say something like, atheists are the people who, or particularly new atheists, say, there is no God and I hate him, right? And they're trying to draw out this idea that there's an inconsistency, that the new atheists or the secularists or whoever, they say there is no God, but they also are really hostile towards him and say all these horrible things about him, and they really seem to hate God, right? There is no God and I hate him. Now, although it's an amusing turn of phrase, there's nothing inconsistent about hating a non-existent entity at all. Anyone who's watched a film and really despised an antagonist understands that you can perfectly well hate something that doesn't exist, right? Because there's different levels of discourse, right? When we talk about hating something, that's a mental attitude, and you can have a mental attitude towards non-existent things. So there's no inconsistency between, hating something that doesn't exist. There's likewise no inconsistency in talking about things that don't exist. So we might talk about beliefs even though there aren't any, just as like we talk about Santa Claus, but there isn't one, or we talk about God, but there isn't one. Oh, sick burn. But so Rosenberg may well appeal to something like that. I mean, maybe he says something different. I don't know. But the point is, there's no inconsistency in talking about things that don't exist. One is an account of what exists in reality in like an ontological, fundamental, philosophical sense, and the other one is everyday language. Everyday language is loose and sloppy, and you don't have to ground everyday language in terms of something that really exists. Sometimes you will, of course, presumably some things in everyday language refer to things that exist, although, maybe if you're really skeptical about things, you would deny that. But, not everything does. We have lots of language that is non-literal or doesn't really refer to anything. So this sort of simplistic, knee-jerk, "Oh, does he believe that?" kind of response, I just think is embarrassing. It just shows that you don't understand. Well, it either shows you're intellectually dishonest or you don't understand what the position is that you're responding to. It's just juvenile nonsense.
It leads to such absurd, self-defeating, kind of things. And I think this is why what's becoming popular, and it's interesting because, like I said, and like we've kind of been talking about.
I honestly never could have guessed getting into apologetics that I was going to find people that just deny that consciousness exists.
Now, I think they're being logically consistent, which I can appreciate. Right?
Yeah. I mean, Rasmussen even has some, like, he surveys some arguments for illuminism.
Yeah.
So it's like they have reason to think that they don't have any.
Their thoughts and beliefs have reason to give them that they have thoughts and beliefs, right?
It's very strange.
But again, they're trying to be logically consistent, and I think like what
they don't think that they have thoughts and beliefs, which lead them to think there are no thoughts and beliefs, right? That's the same thing about Eric injecting his view into their view. They don't think there are such things as thoughts and beliefs, right? So the question you have to ask them is, how do you give an account of what we appeal to when we talk about thoughts and beliefs? Like, how do you, like the illuminativists, how do they understand intentional language, language that appeals to like thoughts or beliefs? And how do they distinguish between true and false beliefs? Like, it seems that there's a difference between two different states that a person could be in, one in which they would say they have a true belief, one in which they have a false belief. Basically, what you need to ask is, how do they account for these differences that at least seem to exist? And they could deny that the differences themselves even exist, which I think is less plausible. Like, there's no difference between a person it's hard, right? Because they reject the language, but there's no difference between a person who has a mental representation that doesn't correspond to the facts and one who has a mental representation that does correspond to the facts, right? That's the true false thing, but I'm trying not to use those words, right? So do you ask them, how do you account for these sorts of phenomenon? Or how do you account for the appearance of phenomenal qualia? That would be another example, or the fact that many people report this. And that's the argument that you have to make. And I think that, so the good response is to say that we can defend the notion of belief because it plays a useful theoretical role in a certain discourse. So it sort of earns its place in our discourse as a theoretical item by virtue of how useful it is in describing certain behaviors and certain mental states, and it's used in psychology and whatever. Like, you explain why it's useful, and you try to give an account as to how it can exist in a physical sense. That's how I think about this, and that's why I'm not on limitativist, because I think that we can make a good we can tell a good physicalist account about how beliefs can exist, and they actually are quite useful as concepts, as a way of describing things, and so I think they can be retained and needn't be eliminated. Although we may need to reform our understandings of them somewhat, just as we've reformed our understanding of many things over history, atoms being a classic example, which by definition means indivisible, but now we know that they're not. We've reformed our understanding. Likewise, we may have to reform our understanding about many things like beliefs and consciousness in light of new neuroscientific understandings. But nevertheless, I think as long as there's a sufficient continuity with previous ideas and that the concepts serve a useful role in our discourse, we can preserve them, right? So this is, I think, a sensible, or dare I say, more mature, more honest way of having this discussion. It's like, oh, you don't think that there are such things as beliefs? Well, how do you make sense of this and that and the other thing? Like, where we would use belief talk, how do you make sense of that? How do you account for these different aspects of reality that seem to need belief talk? And there's different things that they can say about that. But instead, what people like Eric and I think Cameron here do is, and Craig does this a lot as well, is that they confuse the phenomena with their own theoretical account of the phenomenon. So they confuse the notion, the theoretical notion of a belief, with the thing that they experience as having when they form a mental representation of something, right? And generally, the eliminativist is going to say, well, like, there's something happening in your brain, right? that is the thing that happens when you think you have a belief. But they're going to say, but that's not a belief, because belief is tied up with all these other confused ideas that are bundled in this sort of folk psychology that doesn't make any sense, right? And has all these contradictions and whatever. So we need to throw that out, and we need to throw out belief talk with it because it's confused. So an example of this that I would point to is soul talk. I think soul talk is bound up with a whole bunch of ideas about dualism and ghosts and possession and the afterlife and things like that. And I don't think that soul talk can be given any really coherent or sensible physicalist grounding. So we should get rid of it. I think it's non-referring. And so I'm an eliminativist about souls, right? No souls, get rid of them. So essentially, we shouldn't talk about them other than as purely like fictional or non-existent entities. But I think that I'm not a limitist about beliefs or desires, because I think that they can serve a useful purpose and do serve a useful purpose, and we can understand them, we can ground them or reduce them to physicalist states of affairs, right? Like ultimately cognitive states. So I have a different attitude. I'm an eliminativist about souls, but not about beliefs and desires. There are some people who are eliminatists about a lot of them, right? They think that they all need to go. But the point is that the phenomena people talk about, like if someone was to say, well, you don't think there's a soul, but like, okay, so you don't think that there are people, like, or that people think or anything like that, because they think that souls are like the seat of thought and consciousness and personhood, right? But I don't think that. So when I say there's no soul, I don't mean that there's no like person or consciousness or identity or anything like that. Like, that's them projecting their own theory about what souls are and what they do onto the phenomena that we're trying to explain. So I think that that's very common, and that's essentially what Eric and Cameron are doing here. They don't actually understand the view that people like Rosenberg argue for, which is really, as I understand it at least, unlimitedness about these sort of theoretical terms that emerge from folk psychology. Although I think Rosenberg is a very thoroughgoing eliminativist, so he may even go further than just the psychological side of it. But the point is that you can't just reject a view because it contradicts or it runs counter to how you like to describe something. What you have to establish is that their way of theorizing about it is worse than your way of theorizing about it, because it doesn't account for the facts as well, or there's an internal inconsistency, or it's more complex or something like that. You can't just say, well, that doesn't make sense based on how I understand it, so that's obvious nonsense. That's just, well, I don't know what to say about that other than it's terrible philosophy and a lazy way to think. Yeah, like it's exactly this point. You don't think souls exist? Is that thought produced by your soul? Like, where does that come from if it's not for your soul? Well, obviously, I don't think it comes from my soul because I don't think there are souls. So that's just not an objection. Oh, welcome, welcome, Digital Gnosis. Good to see you on here. Fodot. I hope that was a deliberate misspelling. If there's one guy that knows about AI, computer science, and consciousness, then Eric Pastor Hernandez is he. Yes, agreed. Given what we heard before about neural elasticity, that's got to be one of my favorites.
Jackson says is you have to locate these somehow in this grand natural story, or you have to eliminate them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is why men like Thomas Nagel and a few others that escape my mind at the moment are now kind of punting, and I would say punting to something like panpsychism.
Yeah, it's becoming way more popular.
It is because
there's a famous guy. Well, is he famous? Philip Goff. I'm sure you've seen.
I don't know if there's any evidence that panpsychism is becoming more popular. I think that they're just becoming more well known, particularly Philip Goff and Thomas Nagel. It's still a small minority view. I guess when the next Phil paper survey is done in 5 or 10 years or something, we might get an idea if it's increasing in popularity. But at the moment, it's a very, very small, like a few percentage view. Like it's smaller than substance dualism, and that itself is a small view. So I think that there can be I don't know why people like Eric and Cameron will be sort of excited about the notion of panpsychism, because it's not a dualist view. It's an explicitly not dualist view. So it's contrary to their own views and explicitly undermines the argument that Eric was giving before, at least implicitly, that if you reject, actually, no, he explicitly said this. He said that the two live options are physicalism or naturalism and theism. Well, panpsychism is neither of those, right? Or at least general conceptions of them is neither of those things. And so it kind of undermines his own argument, but somehow they get excited about it. I don't really get that, but whatever.
Seen him. Yeah, he's been on Joe Rogan. He's been on a bunch of big shows.
He's been on Joe Rogan, guys. Not just anyone goes on Joe Rogan.
So he's probably more famous than we are.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, he's been on those shows.
You gotta get Craig on Rogan's show now.
I know.
So
hopefully.
I think it's showing though that what's always been interesting in just the history of this kind of stuff is Christianity and philosophy, religion in general. Is Christians put this up, and then atheists kind of, it's almost like playing chess, right? You're making the next move, the next move.
True.
So I think that now, like, I think consciousness in the academic area is starting to really, or it has been really gaining traction. In fact, John Searle, an atheist philosopher of mine, has said something like how he's embarrassed for the past 50 years in the philosophy of mind, how people who have tried to defend or articulate physicalism have just done a horrible job. And he says it's been a waste of time. There's an atheist philosopher saying this about philosophers of mind who are naturalists. Now, without going to his option.
What a shock that there are philosophers who say that other philosophers have been wasting their time about things like, that's never happened before.
There's this realization that, okay, let's not be self-defeating. So what can we do? And I think the best option is to punt to a panpsychism where say, okay, the physical doesn't create consciousness, but what if we just front load it and just put it in everything to begin with? So under the right physical conditions, the matter in this chair can be conscious. Now, I think I've heard Moreland say something like, well, bless our hearts. I mean, that's a great attempt, but note what they're implicitly conceding. If it's not there to begin with, you're not going to get it by rearranging stuff. And what I think is most ironic is, wait a minute, so you're punting to the idea that ultimate reality at its core must be mental. Well, why not just become a Christian? It's like you're trying to take that cake and eat it too. So yeah, I mean, they can.
I think Eric has, well, this is all play acting, but I don't get that sense. It's like Eric has absolutely no capability of seeing things through any view other than his own. Because I think we just saw this here, right, as yet another example. Oh, well, he's sort of talking about the panpsychist here. You're saying that reality is fundamentally mental. So why not become a Christian? Well, because, Eric, panpsychists think that substance dualism, which you think is essential Christianity, I don't think it is, but let's put that aside. Panpsychists think that substance dualism is nonsense because panpsychism is in direct opposition to substance dualism. Substance dualism says that, at least the Cartesian version of it, it says that there are physical substances and there are mental substances and that they interact in some way to give rise to the mind, or at least give rise to like human persons. there's a question as to how God fits into that, because as I've noted before, God is not a hybrid entity, a soul, and he's not an embodied soul. He's just a soul, I guess. Or, I mean, is he a soul? I don't know. That would mean that he's sort of metaphysically the same type of entity as humans, and that kind of seems wrong. So I don't know what Eric would say about that. But the point is that whatever humans are, God's got to be a different kind of thing, beast altogether. But whatever those two things are, neither of those is what panpsychists say, which is that, well, there's different versions, but usually it would be something like that, that consciousness or qualia is a fundamental, irreducible property of all physical systems. And so, yes, in a sense that reality at its core foundations is mental, or at least has mental aspects, I think probably be a better way of saying it. But that's not that's so different from substance dualism, which says that matter, physical matter at its core, is not mental, but there are types of entities that are, and then they sort of interact and come together. I haven't seen a lot of this specifically, but my understanding is that panpsychists will accept many of the classic arguments against substance dualism, like the interaction problem, like the what is the nature of this substance supposed to be argument, like the what's the other argument about the I forgot what it's called, which is like which soul interacts with which body and how does it keep the one-to-one association. I've forgotten what that argument's called. But anyway, so the panpsychist is going to endorse many of these arguments, but then they're also going to endorse arguments against physicalism, and they're going to advance their own arguments in favor of panpsychism. But it doesn't seem like Eric can see that. All he can see is, oh, well, it's against physicalism, so it must be for Christianity, because somehow that's the only other view. And he can't see the difference between any different views. And he just is completely unable to apparently conceive of the idea that there could be people who agree with his criticisms of one worldview, but don't agree with his conclusions, and also provide criticisms against what he views. I don't know how else to explain how he could say what he just said there. Like, oh, why not just become a Christian? Well, because they don't agree with your position. They have the similar objections to the physicalists. It's just that they've gone in a different direction. Like, well, so respond to that. Like, what?
Eliminate it, but again, it's become popular now to kind of lean towards panpsychism. I think that gets into other problems that we don't necessarily have to talk about. But what I think it's showing is the weight that the soul and consciousness kind of plays into these discussions.
Yeah, the
soul doesn't play any role in these discussions. You look at the literature in this. No one's talking about souls. Even the substance dualists don't typically talk about souls. Like, I've forgotten his name. There's a substance dualist in the Philosophy of Mind book that I haven't. But he's not a Cartesian substance dualist. He's not an interactionist substance dualist. The type of substance dualist that Eric is the type that the other substance dualists look at and say, oh, no, we're not that guy. Like, we're not the interactionist Cartesian substance dualists. They're the crazy ones, right? So, like, there's no one apart from the Christian apologists who are talking about souls in the philosophical literature. I'm sure there's literally not one, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it is not in any way mainstream. Most of the discussion is based on comparing physical attempts to ground things like intentionality and qualia. And there are people who are critical of that, of course. Some of them don't necessarily endorse any particular account. Others are some form of property dualists, or there are a few panpsychists who are sort of fairly loud. Then there are dualists like, bugger, what's his name? The Australian guy whose name has escaped me. But yeah, so there are some, but even those are generally not the interactionist type of substance dualist. So to say that the soul is really important in this discussion is just not true, or at least I've not seen that. And I would need some convincing evidence that it's playing any significant role at all. I think it's more correct to say that the notion of a soul has been abandoned in contemporary analytic philosophy, at least mostly, as far as anything is ever abandoned in philosophy. And even though there are critiques of physicalism, physicalism remains by far the most popular position. And David Chalmers, yeah, thanks Nathan, that's who I was thinking of. Yeah, so he's some kind of dualist, but I don't really know exactly what variety, but I don't think he's Eric's kind of dualist. Anyway, yeah, so if anything, physicalism is the main game in town, and there's debate about the limits of that and how to understand that. And Eric's view, this sort of interaction of substance dualism, is an absolutely tiny fringe minority. Now, that doesn't make it wrong, of course, but he's presenting it as if it's this very powerful view that's sort of attracting more and more people, which he hasn't given any evidence for in any way. He was talking about a rival view that's distinct from his own, panpsychism. So it's just a whole disaster. Like, if you're going to say that, give a few examples of recent papers that have explicitly invoked a soul in the philosophical discourse in defense of these sorts of arguments, and not from apologetics journals, from actual like philosophy of mind mainstream journals. That would substantiate this kind of argument. But of course, we don't get anything like that. We just get sort of vague appeals that, oh, you know, this is important and people are taking this seriously. Well, they're not. Like, no one's talking about souls. Come on. Yes, there are critiques of physicalism, but no one's invoking souls.
Kind of thought that came to my mind with respect to panpsychism. We were talking about it a little bit. Whoops. Now you guys can see me. We were talking about it before the show, before we started, was the problem of the unity of consciousness, right? And so even if you have every fundamental particle has some level of consciousness, and then you throw it all together, you throw a bunch of them together in a particular arrangement, and then you get some higher level of consciousness. How does that actually work? How do you get from these different fundamental things that each of themselves have some sort of level of consciousness? How do you then get a single unit of consciousness that has this sort of like movie-like experience of the world? And how does that work? I'm sure that that was one of the things that you could have brought up if you wanted to.
Yeah. So why you need a substantial self to kind of ground consciousness, to possess consciousness and whatnot. So Eric LaRocque has an interesting argument, which is kind of similar to Hasker's argument. Hasker's argument is the unity of consciousness. LaRocque focuses on the unified visual field of consciousness. And the way I've typically argued it, and I'll use his illustration as well and kind of modify it, is so if we have two options on the table, that either you are a substantial whole, and I would say that would have to be something like a soul, or you're an aggregate. If for the physicalist, and there's different versions, but suffice to say that you are an aggregate, again, a Lego bricks, if you will. I'm not a substantial whole. There's different types of part-to-whole relations. Like, you take a heap of sand, you could call that a whole, but you can see how it's only a whole in the sense that there are certain parts spatially located close together. But then it becomes a problem, which is kind of what you're leaning at. Well, there's a piece of sand over there. Do we count that as part of this heap, or do we have to move? How close does it have to be?
Yeah.
You know, those kind of with mereological problems. And then take a car.
I mean, I know I'm playing it at fast speed, 1.5, but that doesn't help. That just means the words are closer together and, you know, take up less time. It doesn't actually change the way they're put together. Eric's just so bad at explaining this stuff. He just talks about all of the, I'm not saying I do it perfectly, but he just throws in mereology there without explaining what he means by that. So mereology is the study of parts and wholes, right? So what is the relationship between different parts that make up something and the whole thing? I think well, this is maybe a bit of a hot take. I think most of the philosophy of mereology is a whole lot of nonsense, to be honest, or at least it's not very useful. Some of it's actually quite formalized. Not really sure what use there is to that. But anyway, there are some interesting questions, I think, you know, like the paradox of the heap, for example. Well, when does a heap become not a heap after taking away individual parts of it? Like, that is a bit strange. How do we think about that? I think that's useful to talk about. But anyway, so what Eric's talking about here is, if we think of the self or a person, I'm not sure exactly what term he prefer. If we think of a person as a mind or person as an aggregate, a combination of parts like atoms or cells or whatever, then how do we understand what happens when we take some of those away? Like, you lose some brain cells, or you lose an arm or something like that, or even just some atoms of skin fall off. Like, well, the parts that you're made up of have changed. And over time, more and more of them changed as, you know, elements are cycled out of your body, atoms are replaced every few years. So the parts have changed. How do we understand what's happened to the aggregate? It's basically the ship of Theseus that we were talking about before. You replace the parts, what happens to the whole? That's an interesting question. I think what Eric's going to say is, well, you need to have some sort of he calls it unify, but I think indivisible or atomic, non-reducible entity or substance that grounds the continuity of personhood or identity over time. We've kind of already discussed this before, so I don't want to go over it again unless he makes a different argument here. But I mean, one of the main problems here is simply that these mereological problems are very broad, and they don't just apply to the mind. They apply to anything else that's an aggregate that's made up of parts. And so I don't understand how postulating a soul is supposed to be a solution when it involves a fairly heroic metaphysical commitment to souls. And like, what is that? How does that work? That doesn't actually resolve any of the other problems, even if you think it resolves the personhood one, which is questionable that it does, in my view, but let's maybe leave that. It certainly doesn't solve any of the other ones, unless you think that ships and mountains and nation states and whatever also have souls, which maybe they could. I mean, could God give them souls if he wanted to? Maybe he could. I don't know. There's no. If you can find a list of constraints on what God can and cannot do, then that would be very interesting. But usually it's left completely undefined, so you can just stuff whatever you like in there. That's why it's a terrible theory. But let's see where Eric's going with this.
Well, that seems to still be an aggregate, but it's a much deeper whole connection than a heap of sand. And then you take a living organism like us. Well, you know, so you have this hierarchy, and I would say that the soul. Well, here's what Moreland once said: is that the soul is mereologically simple but metaphysically complex. So it's not a collection of separate parts. It's a single substantial whole. All that to say is you're going to need some whole to ground these things. And now let's go to Eric LeRock's argument. So
the self is, or the soul is, mereologically simple but metaphysically complex. This feels like one of those things you read on a fortune cookie, right? Where it's like, that's interesting, but you have no idea what it means. Like, what are you talking about? I won't even try to figure that out. Yeah, Nathan's brain's falling out of his head. I can see in the comments here. I wanted to share one before. Not that one. Where was it? Yeah. So one interpretation of what Eric was saying about panpsychism is if you're gonna make up some dumb ad hoc crap, then you might as well just become a Christian. I don't think that's what Eric meant, but that is a spicy interpretation there. But there was another thing. Now I can't see it. But anyway, yes, Nathan was saying he's an eliminativist about apologetics. He thinks that, well, I mean, that would mean that you think apologetics doesn't exist, right? Not that you necessarily, that we should eliminate talk about apologetics, I suppose maybe is what is meant there. But yeah, on mereology is just another useless part of metaphysics where we try to create certain riddles out of vagueness of natural language. Maybe we should have a longer discussion about this because I wouldn't go quite as far as that because I mean there is vagueness in natural language, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask how do we think about that? Like how do we make sense of that? Of course, then what sort of answers you give is going to vary a lot there. But yeah. Anyway, let's keep. Yeah, this is a good point. There's like an argument from Fortune Cookie slogans. You're more than your body. Yeah, like I really dislike philosophy by basically like sloganizing, and it's not just apologists or Christian philosophers like Moreland who do that. Other philosophers do that as well, where they'll sort of say something that sounds reasonable, but it doesn't actually seem to answer any question, or maybe it seems compelling to the person saying it, but to other people, it's like I don't understand what point you're trying to make. But I think that's a bad way of doing philosophy. It's just to sort of say things that seem true and then sort of string them together in a way that carries your reader along. And you sort of imply that you've answered the question, but it's like, well, I don't actually understand how that answers the question. The question is, how do souls relate to minds and bodies and things like that? And it's like, well, the soul is mereologically simple, but metaphysically complex. And then we're sort of like, yes. I don't know what to do with that.
And the way I modify it is, okay, I'm either a soul, a material substance, or an aggregate, a collection of parts. Well, if I am an aggregate, then I'm not going to have a unified visual field. Let's say that's a second premise. Now, why not? We now know through neuroscience that when I look at an object, and again, the dualists, for some reason, people think dualists deny this. Like an objection I get from like non-believers is, yeah, but if I don't know, like Alzheimer's can make you lose your memory. I'm like, right, go on. Sure. No different than detuning a guitar while I'm playing it is going to affect the sound. Like, sure, what's your point? So we now know through neuroscience that
that's the interaction problem he's referring to, which I'm sure he won't ever at any point try to actually give a response to. Maybe he will. I'm being unfair, perhaps, but anyway.
Not only are we able to see more cause and effect relationships with certain mental states, we also know that what brain regions or brain firings are correlated with certain mental states. So when I look at an object, we know that certain regions of my brain are correlated with certain aspects of an object, like the size, the shape, the distance, the color, whether it's in motion or rest. But
why is that expected, Eric, under dualism? Why is it expected that there would be specific correlations between the activity in quite specific regions of the brain, is in the occipital cortex, the back of the brain, and particular types of visual percepts? I'm not saying that that's inconsistent with dualism, because basically nothing is inconsistent with dualism. That's why it's a bad theory. But it doesn't seem to be expected under dualism, which says that those phenomenal states are arising because of some kind of interaction with some physical, non-physical mumbo-jumbo, soul, whatever. Why would you expect there to be particular brain regions that correlate with that? Like, that seems way more expected under physicalism, which says that those phenomenal states are entirely produced by the products of particular types of brain activity. And this is what dualists just don't acknowledge this. They'll just say, oh yeah, we're perfectly fine with correlations between brain states and qualia. Yeah, but are those expected? Like, why would you expect any particular correlations to exist, let alone like functional localization of brain regions? I don't see how any of that's expected under dualism. I mean, maybe I'm trying to make it do more than it really can, because I mean, what is expected under dualism? I actually have no idea, right? Because it's so underspecified. But at the very least, it doesn't really seem to give you any natural reason to think that, or to expect that particular brain regions would be functionally localized such that activity in those regions correlates with particular types of perceptual states of different aspects of visual objects and so forth. That seems to be way better explained under physicalism than under dualism, where they just seem to have to say, I don't know, that's just the way souls go, bro. Like, I don't know, they wiggle and this part of the brain does its thing. And I don't know, like souls do what they do. Like what it's just that's why it's just a joke as far as I'm concerned, as a serious, at least this type of interactionalist dualism, substance dualism, is just a joke as far as a serious intellectual proposition is, because there's just no way to account for any particular cognitive finding or neuroscientific finding or anything. They just wave their hands and say, oh, it's correlations, bro. Like, trust me. It's just pathetic. I just have no time for it.
But these correlating brain states terminate in certain parts of the brain. In other words, there is no part of the brain that takes all these little pieces and puts them together. So if you think, so you're a photographer, right? We're capturing Christianity here. If I were to take a picture and pixels, if you threw, hypothetically, if you can get a box of pixels and throw, or a puzzle, let's say, right? You throw on the floor. Well, you're not going to see the whole picture unless you have something that puts the picture together into one unified field. Larock argues that, well, why do we have a unified visual field? Why, when I look at an object, I don't just see first the color and then I see the shape, and then, why do I see all of it together? So here's his illustration, which again, I'm modifying. He says, suppose you have 5 chefs working on a recipe for a cake, and you take these 5 chefs, but they're each working on a certain part of the recipe, and you put them in 5 different kitchens. What do you need to get a whole unified cake? Because them being in separate parts of the kitchen isn't going to work. Now, some have argued, well, if they're all working on it at the same time, you'll eventually get that cake. Well, no, you still won't, especially given, this is why I kind of push further and say, well, let's say they're locked in separate kitchens, whatever. In order to get a quote unquote unified whole cake, you're going to need a master chef to get those ingredients they finish working on and then put those into one whole cake. So Larock argues, well, that's what you need a soul for. You need something transcendent to the physical that is going to take these aspects that are correlated with these brain states. This part of the brain terminates and is correlated with the color, this part, this. You're going to need some master chef, if you will, that takes all those properties of that object in your unified visual field and put them together into a panoramic, if you will, and have this whole unified conscious visual field cake, if you will. So
I'm going to have to stop soon. This is really driving me insane. So what Eric is talking about is often called the binding problem. So the idea is that there are different aspects. Well, let's take vision as an example, but it applies more generally. There are different aspects of a visual percept. So there's, shape, and there's color, there's texture, there's position in the visual field, motion. All of these things are processed, well, sort of in parallel, but there's particular regions of the occipital cortex that specialize in processing, like there's a what and a where pathway that people may have heard about that specialize in processing particular aspects of this, of different parts of the visual field. And so the question is, how are those integrated into a single conscious percept? Because we don't really experience like a bundle of, it's not even clear what this would be, but we don't experience a bundle of texture here and a bundle of shapes there and a bundle of movement over here or something. We experience it as an integrated whole. The question is, how does that work? How does that happen? I think this is an interesting and valid scientific and sort of cognitive question with maybe some philosophical implications as well. Now, as usual, Eric takes that and does a poor job at explicating it, and then presents it as a mystery, which can only be resolved by an even bigger mystery, which is some soul thing that just sort of solves the problem. Maybe this is just me struggling to understand different points of view, but I've really tried to do this because I raise this all the time. I don't understand how anyone takes these sorts of explanations as satisfactory. Whenever you ask, how does something work? If someone just said, well, it's a schmlob, and you said, well, what's a schmlob? And their answer is, well, it's a special type of entity that has just the causal powers to explain the thing that we're talking about. No one would take that seriously. It's just a joke. Like, you can't just take the thing you're trying to explain, give it another name, and say that's the explanation of it. But that's literally what substance dualists, at least of Eric's sort, I mean, I've seen better arguments for them, but at least of Eric's sort do. They just take, like, the binding problem. How do we combine these different aspects of perception, of visual processing into a single percept? And they just say, oh, souls do that. Well, how? Like, how does that work? How do they do it? Like, what is the process of doing that? Like, why do they work that way? Oh, because they do. I just said that they do. Like, well, what's the problem? Like, well, how is anyone persuaded by that? Like, that's a serious question. How is anyone persuaded by that? The normal approach, by the way, in philosophy to argue for dualism would be to give some sort of deductive argument for it, or to maybe do some sort of kind of like what Eric was trying to do before. You sort of say, well, it's either this or this, and we reject the other option, so we're sort of forced to conclude dualism. I don't think that those approaches are very satisfactory. But this sort of explanatory attempt to say, like, well, physicalism can't explain this, so it must be a soul that explains it. I just don't really see this in the literature, and it's probably because it's just hopeless when you're appealing something like a soul that has no constraints on what it does or what its causal powers are or how it works or what it interacts with or anything. It has no explanatory power at all, as far as I'm concerned, unless you want to actually give a serious attempt to explain the soul. And some people have come up with some very interesting hypothesis, often with the word quantum involved somewhere, but I don't know that Eric goes into that. Maybe he does. I don't know. But the point is, it's just a joke, right? I don't know why anyone takes this seriously. It's just defining what we're trying to explain into defining the phenomenon we're trying to explain as part of our proposed explanation and leaving it at that. I might as well just say that there's a special region of the cortex that does the job of binding, and it does it because it just has that special causal power. Shut up and don't ask any more questions. Because that's, I mean, I think that's even more plausible, although I don't think there is such a region of the cortex. I think that the integration is achieved in a distributed way. There doesn't have to be one region. There doesn't have to be a boss that tells all the other regions of the brain what happens. Neuroscientists have looked for that, and increasingly there doesn't seem to be one such region, certainly not for perception at least. It's much more distributed and parallel in its method of processing. I guess theists probably don't like to think like that. They like to think in sort of top-down ways, that there's one boss at the top who tells everyone else what to do, and he's ultimately in charge, because that's the way they see the world, I guess. So maybe it's hard for Eric to think about things as sort of a distributed, parallel, sort of bottom-up emergent kind of phenomenon. But anyway, even if you don't think that, you can just say, oh, there's a region of the brain that we haven't detected yet that just sort of does this, and that's no worse than Eric's proposal.
Even have something like a unified visual field, you're going to need something to ground all those properties that you're looking at.
So I'd like to, at this point, discuss a couple objections to dualism, and then we can kind of move to talk about some debates that you've done. Oh, yeah. And that should be a lot of fun. So I'm sure
it'll be a barrel.
I may just raise one. So this is probably the most well-known objection: the interaction problem. How does the mental interact with the physical?
Let's see what he has
so what are your
to say
thoughts
about
on this problem? First of all, articulate it for the audience.
Yeah. So the interaction problem is really a question. As we know here, questions aren't arguments. It's really a question as well. How does something immaterial act on the physical and whatnot, or even vice versa?
What is the mechanism? Or
right. Hasker, I think it was Hasker who said something like that is like the most, what do you call it? Like the most overrated objection, like in philosophy. He's like, I'm tired of hearing that. Like it's not a good objection. It's not even an objection. Honestly, it's a question. And I think I first heard Moreland point this out, that it's really an epistemic question, not an ontological question. Because if my arguments pass, which I haven't shared
almost all of Eric's arguments have been epistemic questions. It's like, well, how does consciousness arise from the brain? How many neurons do I have to put together before it's conscious? How could it be that an AI could be conscious? Most of these are just, in his parlance, epistemic questions. They're not impossibility questions. I think the Chinese room argument is a bit different there, but it's also, I think he was misusing that. Anyway, it's the usual double standards. One standard for me, one for thee. I can make purely epistemic arguments, but you can't. It has to be an ontological argument. But also, that's not even true. So the interaction, I mean, it depends how you phrase it, right? You could phrase it as a purely epistemic objection, but usually it's not phrased like that. Usually it's combined with the notion of the causal closure of the physical. So the idea is that the physical world is causally closed. So all causes that occur on physical things are exerted by other physical things. There's nothing outside of the physical world that acts on it, or vice versa. Causal world is physically closed. That's usually justified by, say, the success of physics, which kind of assumes the causal closure of the physical. There aren't sort of these arbitrary non-physical causes that just change things that aren't described by our equations. Success of physics, there's a conservation of energy, momentum types arguments, or conservation laws are appealed to. One can appeal to the failure to detect any violations of the causal closure of the physical. We haven't found massive gaps. Interestingly, I think that actually, no, let's not go into that. That's just going to muddy the water. There's arguments that you could make. Some people try to advert to quantum mechanics or whatever, but I don't think that works very well. So the point is that usually the physicalist is going to appeal to the causal closure of the physical, and that they can defend that by various appeals to science, or just purely conceptual ideas about what a non-physical thing would even be. And so on that basis, they're going to say, well, the causal world the physical world is causally closed. Therefore, it's just impossible, metaphysically impossible, that there's any interaction between a physical state and an immaterial state. So even if there is immaterial souls or whatever, they can't do anything, that they are causally inert, would be the argument there. That's typically how the argument goes. Now, that is not an epistemic argument. That is an ontological or metaphysical argument. It says that it's literally impossible for non-physical entities to exert physical effects on physical entities. Now, generally the physicalist is going to take the next step and say, well, what's the point in postulating these causally inert non-physical entities? Let's just get rid of them and say they don't exist. But theoretically, you wouldn't have to do that. You wouldn't have to actually get rid of them. You just say that they're causally inert. So it is a separate step. But anyway, so I don't understand how this is supposed to be an epistemic objection. It's not an objection about knowledge, even though many of Eric's have been. So I don't know what the problem is even of making that argument. But it's as metaphysical as you can get. It's saying that it's metaphysically impossible for there to be something outside the physical world that exerts a cause on the physical world. Let's talk about that, Eric, because that's the substance of the objection.
But just from what we talked about, if my arguments pass that a soul exists, and your question is, well, how does it interact with the body? Note that does nothing to affect my ontological arguments that souls are required for these features of reality, like mental states. So at best, it's a question, not an objection. And on top of that, it's epistemic, not ontological. Because I could say, I don't know. Now what follows from that? Nothing.
Double standards. Okay, so so all of these questions that you just asked about the physical is like, how many neurons does it take to become conscious, or how does an AI give rise to consciousness, or these other things, or the binding problem? How do we combine those different aspects of the visual field? I mean, not 1 minute ago you were raising this objection. I could just say, I don't know. What follows from that? It's an epistemic objection. How does Eric not see this? Like, seriously, how does Eric not see that he's just made not necessarily inconsistent claims, but he's using inconsistent standards? Epistemic objections were okay before when he raised them. Certainly sounded like epistemic objections to me, but now they're not okay when they're being raised by the physicalist. Like, what? How do you? Is it just okay to be intellectually dishonest and inconsistent now? I don't know. To me, that's not an okay thing to do.
I'm not very good with cars. I'm not a mechanic. But if I drive my car to get here, I say, oh, I've got a car and it works great and it exists. You say, but how does it work? Oh my gosh, I don't know. My car doesn't disappear from the driveway. It's still there.
Oh my God. I'm really going to have to stop very soon. This is not this is not the interaction problem. The interaction problem isn't how does it work? I mean, I suppose you could articulate it that way, but that's not how it's usually articulated, nor the strongest form. The strongest form usually says the physical world is causally closed. Therefore, it is impossible for there to be anything that interacts with the physical world, including souls. And souls are supposed to, Cartesian souls are supposed to causally interact with the physical world. Therefore, they don't exist. That's actually a deductive argument. So you have to reject one of the premises. Presumably, the interaction of substance dualists is going to reject the causal closure of the physical. By the way, not all substance dualists do this. There are substance dualists who accept the causal closure of the physical, and, well, at that point, I'm not quite sure exactly. I've read some things that they say, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But the point is that there are substance dualists who actually accept this. I think that it's even the majority of them do, although I don't have data on that. But the point is that even some substance dualists agree with this point, that it's at least reasonable to accept that the physical world is causally closed. It's considered pretty extreme to deny that explicitly in philosophy, I think is fair. Not many philosophers are brave enough to explicitly deny the causal closure of the physical, because that seems like a very anti-science thing to do, and a very risky maneuver, especially very epistemically risky, I should say very metaphysically risky. But an interaction of substance dualist just has to reject that, unless they want to say that souls are physical, which they don't. Okay, so they have to reject the causal closure of the physical. So let's talk about that then, Eric. So if you're going to reject the causal closure of the physical, you actually are asserting that souls exert a causal effect on neurons. So I'm going to talk about how neurons work and ask you, at what point does the soul intervene there? Do souls interact with ion channels? What part of the protein do they move so that the conductivity of the ion channel to sodium ions changes, that allows the neuron to depolarize, which allows it to fire an action potential, which transmits signals across the brain? This substance dualists don't want to talk about this because, that's science. That's boring. Like, I don't care about that. I mean, maybe there are some substance dualists who really do like science, but I don't know how you put that square peg in the round hole. The point is, they never actually want to talk about details. They never actually want to get into and even try to explain how you can say that how you can reject the causal closure of the physical, when we know very well how neurons work, and it ain't like they say it is, right? So it's just embarrassing to try to get around this by saying, well, I don't need to know how a car works in order to drive one. Yeah, but there isn't a causal closure of the physical argument that's relevant there, right? And we actually do know how cars work. You might not know, but like, we can build them. And actually, I'd make a similar argument. We know enough about how brains work to know that there ain't no souls there that are doing causal interaction. Maybe there's a soul that doesn't interact causally with the brain. We can't disprove that scientifically. But the idea that there's a causal interaction, either it's so small that it can't be detected and doesn't seem to appear in any of our scientific investigation, sure looks a lot like it doesn't exist then. or you just sort of have to reject a whole swath of sort of neuroscience and cognitive science work, in my opinion. So like, I don't know. That's the question I like to ask if people actually seriously argue that there is a causal interaction between a soul and the brain. I'd like to frame it as which domains of the ion channel proteins are causally affected such that they are moved by the soul so as to change the conductivity of the membrane to ions, allowing there to be changes in the action potential behavior of those neurons, because that's what you need to have changes in brain activity. You need at the bottom there to be changes in the membrane potential. I mean, I suppose there are other possibilities. Maybe that the soul creates ions out of nothing. They just appear on one side or the other of the membrane. That could also do the job. That seems like a lot of work to keep track of, but I suppose they could do that. This is how I sort of approach this. And from my point of view, it's quite reasonable to say that unless we can even get a hint of an account as to how that's supposed to work, it's actually reasonable to say that actually our scientific theories are more or less correct about that, and that doesn't happen. And therefore that premise goes through, and the rest of the argument follows that there is no interaction of substance dualism. Anyway, I'm getting a bit yeah. How does your car work? Works fine. Yes, exactly. That is a good response. Souls can interact with any kind of ion gradient at any time in any way they want. Yes, because they just have that as a sui generis causal power. This is how you get around these things. Yes, they just do have that causal power. I mean, actually, I think that is actually the right response. Like, I think it's a dumb response, but the best response is to simply say, yes, they just have those causal powers to move bits of proteins around, so as to change the conductivity of the cell membrane to ions and so on. It's basically just to bite the bullet and say, yeah, they do that. And I don't know, I guess God engineered the souls to have just the right type of causal powers to interact with certain types of proteins, but not others, because presumably they have an effect on our brains, but they don't like cause our bowels to become leaky or something like that. That also involves ion channels, by the way. So they have just the right type of causal powers to interact with just the right types of ion channels in just the right ways to affect our brain activity. Yeah, I mean, you wonder why I don't buy that.
There's just something I'm ignorant about. Okay, so that's one thing to say on that. The other thing to say is, well, this also seems
we do know how the mental interacts with the physical.
well, I mean, there are different.
That's a bold strategy.
A little bit, but another thing to say is, because at first, let's look at what are the assumptions behind the question, because like I kind of touched on is
what is a negative answer actually going to imply?
Right. Yeah.
Nothing.
And then what is the question even trying to get at?
The negative answer implies that substance dualism is false, as I've just articulated, as the standard argument is. Premise 1, the physical world is causally closed. Premise 2, if substance dualism is true, there would have to be an interaction, a causal interaction between something that's outside the physical world and the physical world. So from premise 1, it's impossible that there's anything that causally interacts with the physical world. So by premise 2, that rules out substance dualism, and therefore substance dualism is false. That's not hard as an argument. Interaction of substance dualists pretty much just always reject the first premise that the physical world is causally closed. It's like they don't even understand that this is how the dialogue goes, and then you have to give an account as to how that works. And some people talk about quantum physics. I've even heard people appeal to general relativity as a way to try to explain that the conservation of energy is actually not true in a global sense in general relativity, or at least there's dispute about that. That's an interesting route to go down, right? But why do I even bother?
Yeah.
And what is the question assuming? Because the question also seems to assume that there is an intermediate mechanism that A interacts with B by way of C.
Mm-hmm.
So they're presupposing that you need some intermediate mechanism. But let's go there for a second. First, I disagree. There might be, but I don't think you need that. But let's say there is. Well, then the next question would just become, well, how does A interact with C in order to interact with B? Well, then you have to posit another mechanism, and then another, and then you get to this infinite regress. So I think the best way to see.
Yeah, it's almost as if that's how science works. Like we break things down into smaller parts until we get to their fundamental properties and basic interactions. And I mean, I suppose we don't know for certainty that there's no infinite regress, but at least current physical theories don't require an infinite regress. They seem to bottom out, currently at the subatomic particles of the standard model. Maybe there's strings below that or something. Don't know, but at least that there isn't a lot of evidence that there's anything deeper, that there's not a good reason to think that it goes on forever, because we don't see the degrees of freedom that we would expect to see if there's lots of little parts that make up the electron or something. They all seem identical as far as we can tell. But anyway, so I reject this idea that in order to articulate a mechanism, you have to then go on an infinite regress. That's dumb. You just have to reduce it down to simple components, which have simple rules of interaction, which are intrinsic to those things. And so, yes, there's a certain amount of postulating there. You postulate that an electron has a certain charge, which interacts with other electric charges in a certain way. And we, go through our quantum field theory and we articulate how that works. And we then build that up into explaining how atoms work and how molecules work and how cells work. It's science, right? Science works. Like, as cringe as that is, like that's kind of the answer in this case. But I don't know. Eric just doesn't seem interested in that. It's like, no, we can't actually have mechanistic reductive explanations. We just have to say, well, it just does, bro. Like, just souls be that way, bro. Like, just stop asking questions.
This is to see that it's a basic primitive action. There is no intermediate mechanism. Same thing with if you ask, how did I get here? Well, first, I got into my car, then I drove this, and I give you the directions. But at some point, I'm going to need to just say, I put the key in the ignition. Like, that's where it starts, right? There has to be, it can be just an A to B there. It doesn't have to be an intervening mechanism. Otherwise, you lead to an infinite regress. As a side note, too, one of the arguments I use for the soul is the existence of free will. Without going into those details, suffice to say that if you're just a purely physical object, then purely physical objects don't act on their own. They're caused to act by external forces. So if I'm purely physical, I would argue that a necessary and sufficient condition for libertarian free will is that you're the first mover. You're not caused by something else. Well, if I'm just physical, I'm going to necessarily be caused by something else because I'm not going to.
Sorry, guys, I am just too tired to go into the free will thing. I'm just going to leave that one. Oh, that's such another can of worms that I just am not. I think I want to go up to the hour mark just to reach that sort of that irrelevant but psychologically important threshold of having gone through an hour of this. Apparently, they're going to start talking about his debates as well, which I'm not too interested in. So I'm just not going to talk about free will there. But I did want to mention something else as well, which is that if the apologist or whoever you're talking to is going to say that the soul just has these sort of primitive causal powers that are irreducible to be able to interact in certain a way to bring about a certain effect. Remember that you can just say, oh, yeah, I agree. It's just that it's the brain that has that. Like, this bit of the brain just has this irreducible causal power to do this other thing. In other words, you say the same words, but instead of appealing to an immaterial substance as having the causal power, you just say that it's some physical object or system or whatever that has that causal power. Kind of like John Searle apparently says about neurons, although I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that view is more reasonable than what Eric is saying here. At least it doesn't violate the causal closure of the physical, but as far as I know. But so the point is, when there's so little constraints on what is being appealed to, you can just do the same thing. You can just make a parity argument for physicalism, and you can do this for whatever you want. Like, you don't have to be a physicalist if you're a panpsychist or if you're, I don't know, a panentheist or whatever. Like, whatever floats your boat. Just take this argument or whatever it is, argument for God, like if it's fine tuning or whatever else, or miracle argument. If the argument is, oh, well, God intervened miraculously in a one-off event, by just directly actualizing his causal powers to bring about this effect in a unique historical circumstance. Just say the same thing. Oh, yes, a combination of physical events that has never happened before just combined to give rise to this effect. Or, I don't know, the souls that live in the worms that power the turtles that are in charge of the world made a spontaneous decision psychically to bring about you just make up anything is the point. And it's not clear what the constraints are on explanations like this. If you just postulate these primitive causal powers that just directly do the thing that you're supposed to be explaining, I think that they're completely non-explanatory for this reason, that the only properties they have are those that they need precisely to explain the effects that they're trying to account for. So you've just re-described the phenomenon from my point of view. And yeah, so I think not the intellectually most honest strategy, but it maybe can effective, or at least a way of illustrating the uselessness of these explanations. This is just a parody of them, to just say the same thing, but when they postulate God or an immaterial soul or something, just use different words. That's one of the examples I like to give for this is resurrection of Jesus. You can just sort of agree with everything they say and say, yeah, but instead of God resurrecting Jesus, it was intelligent aliens who like to play practical jokes. They resurrected Jesus, right? They have technology that we don't understand or whatever. Or you could even say it's just demons who wanted to play around, right? They have powers we don't understand. This, I think, illustrates the problem with sort of these ad hoc, unconstrained explanations, is that the label that's applied to them actually has is actually not doing any explanatory role. So the notion of a soul here, from my point of view, does no explanatory work, whatever. It's just a bag that they stuff in the things that they want to be accounted for, like free will, continuity over time, consciousness, things like that, right? But calling out a soul really has no bearing on anything, because there's no there's no substance, pardon the pun, to that description. That's unlike a physical explanation, which ideally should be consistent with all scientific knowledge and fit into our reductive understanding of how things relate to each other. So there's lots of constraints there that they should abide by if you're doing it correctly, I think. So the point is, you can just take that bag and change the label and call it something else, right? And it just define it as having all of the same causal powers, but it has a different label. Another example of doing this is when I've in cosmological arguments or fine-tuning arguments, instead of God, I'll say it's the it's the mischievous fairies who created the universe or something like that. You just call it a different label. And then if they complain, well, that's the same thing by a different label, you just ad hoc introduce a different property. Oh yeah, but there's, like fairies have immaterial wings and God doesn't have immaterial wings. So it's not God, it's immaterial fairies, but otherwise it's sort of identical. The point of these parity arguments is not that itself is a sufficient response, because that's really just doing what they're doing. It's in a sense just as bad. But the point of it is to try to illustrate the explanatory emptiness, the vacuousness of these types of explanations, that just take the thing that you're trying to explain, or a bunch of them, stuff them in a bag and give it a label that coheres with existing intuitions about the world, like souls or God or intentions or design or whatever. These sort of pre-theoretic notions that people have. You stuff a label, you stuff mysteries in a bag and put a label on it that fits with people's pre-existing intuitions, and then they mistake that as an actual explanation. So to show that, what you can do is replace the label with something that doesn't fit with their pre-theoretic intuitions and ask them to say what the explanatory difference is. I don't actually know if this is rhetorically effective, but at least I think that it might be helpful in some cases. Anyway, yeah, right. So this is the divine vegetable, that the plant that created the cosmos, as I like to say, or shy intuitive fairies, like whatever floats your boat. All right. So yes, this explanation is completely vacuous.
First mover, so you don't have free will. So
free will, blah blah blah.
So the question also seems to assume that you can't have something immaterial because it can't act on the physical. Where I may push back and say, but if you don't have something material to act on the physical, you're not going to have libertarian freedom. And I think that leads into a whole other range of problems systemically and all this other stuff. But that's just kind of like a side note. Now, let's go to, okay, what are the possible responses to how this interaction can happen? There's a few things. One would be,
please don't say quantum.
So Moreland has said something like, because what some people try to argue on top of the question, in other words, to try to make it an argument. I think Sean Carroll may have done something like this, where they say that you can't create new energy. It's a closed system, so to speak. But then Moreland kind of pushes back and says, well, that you're assuming it's a closed system, but it could be, well, if God exists, maybe it's not a closed system. And the same might apply. Just like God can interact in the physical.
Or it's just closed around God.
Yeah,
like God is part of the system.
Sure, yeah.
Well, God can't be part of
interact in the physical. Why can't
God can't be part of the physical world unless you want to say that God is a physical entity. That is non-standard, but interesting. Yeah, I mean, but this is exactly what I said, right? The traditional approach is just to bite the bullet and say that the physical is not causally closed, that God at least can interact with it, and presumably souls as well, although I don't know how Eric understands the connection between God and souls. Because as far as I'm concerned, you could have souls without God. I really do not see the connection between them at all, but that's a whole other question. What else was I going to say about that? Oh, yeah, right. So it's one thing to just assert that the physical world is not causally closed, but then that opens you up to a whole host of objections that I sort of mentioned that before, about why we think that the physical world is causally closed, or at least why it's not certain, but like there's really good evidence to think that there's really good reason to think that there is, and problems that you run into if you deny that.
My soul interact in the physical. In fact, it's a loose analogy, but one way that one can think of our soul in relation to a body is, just as God is omnipresent to the universe, my soul is omnipresent to my body. Again, without going into like heresy, because when I wiggle my toe and wiggle my finger, my soul doesn't have to travel from here to there, and vice versa. I have causal active power at every point in my body. So one, it might not be the case that we're in a closed system. And then two, it could be the case that maybe there is some.
Well, and it can't be the case that the physical world is closed, right? Not if you're in interaction of substantial. It's like that. You can't think that the physical world is causally closed.
Energy created, but the energy that's created is indetectable, because then the question is, well, we should be able to see where the soul is interacting, which I think is weird to ask that. And the reason is, like I've heard non-believers, an objection would be, well, we've never seen a mind without a brain. And I always say, well, rewind, show me when you've ever seen a mind to begin with. You haven't. That goes back to the problem of other minds. Like, well, we need a way to empirically, test it. Well, how do you empirically know there's a mind first? That goes back to the Chinese room argument.
Yeah, so it's just completely changed the subject now. So we're hearing a biting of the bullet where we were that, well, maybe energy is injected into the system from outside. Okay, that's interesting. So then is where I bring out my argument as to which domains of the protein are physically moved by the causal power of the soul. Or even if you can't specify which one specifically, let's have an argument as to why we should think that there's any possibility that that happens. Because, I mean, in theory, you could detect that, right? If neuroscience is getting pretty advanced at the moment, we can what's the word I'm looking for? We can target specific subpopulations of neurons in, generally this isn't done in human brains, like in mouse brains, and label them using fluorescent tags. So there are sort of ways that theoretically you could detect something like this if we knew where to look and what to look for. Of course, the substance dualists will never be able to tell us. And if they even did tell us, it would always be somewhere we haven't looked yet, which is, of course, the issue with these sort of explanations. But it's sort of we're edging to the point is we're edging towards that, but then we've sort of veered off and now he's talking about something else.
All that other stuff. So in other words, I think that's a bad way to object to the soul. But Moreland says it could be that there is energy released, but the amount of energy being released is so insignificant to what's being done. So he uses the illustration. Suppose you go to the Hoover Dam and there's one switch that if you just flip
Why are we talking about the Hoover Dam? Can we not talk about neurons and ion channels? Because there's no freaking Hoover Dam in your brain, but there are neurons. And some philosophers, it seems, don't know anything about anything else except philosophy. And so they can't actually talk about the science, whether this is about like space and time or the mind or even appeals to like history or social science or whatever that might be relevant. It's like they know nothing about anything except philosophy. I'm not saying this is true of all philosophers, but there seem to be some for whom this is true. And so the only things they ever appeal to are just like the silliest, most random, everyday or unrelated examples. Like, oh, we're talking about the interaction of mind and brain. Let's talk about the Hoover Dam. Well, why don't we talk about the actual neuroscience? Like, it doesn't even have to be very specific. But even if we talk about something that's remotely relevant to the specific problem instead of about the Hoover Dam, it just irritates me because it applying our intuitions to the Hoover Dam is unlikely to be helpful to illustrate the key issues or elucidate the problem in the case of mind and brain. So why don't we actually bring it back to the specific case? And this is why I dislike the appeals to sort of everyday intuition. So I wiggle my finger or I experience this. Well, yeah, but maybe that works in the everyday case, but maybe it doesn't work in the specific philosophical context we're talking about. So we need to make sure those analogies are going to be relevant. One way to keep them relevant is to keep them in the domain that we're talking about and not appeal to random other things. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant about these sort of thought experiments. Well, it's not even a thought experiment. It's more of an analogy to make a point. It's not a thought experiment, but let's see where he's going with this.
The switch, it will release all the water. Now, compare the energy used to flip the switch with the energy that is released when all the water comes out. I mean, it's going to drown, no pun intended, the energy of flipping that switch. So he's like, well, maybe the soul does create some kind of energy, but you're not going to detect it because of the amount of energy that's being released, with that. But then there's, I think this is more.
But how does that work in the brain? I mean, what's the analogy? So theoretically, you could activate a single neuron, which could activate two more neurons, which could activate more. This could be sort of like a positive feedback kind of mechanism here. But that's going to lead to a grand mal seizure, right? That's not going to lead to cognition or qualia of any sort of interesting sort. What you need is a kind of a controlled, richly dynamic pattern of activity and processing of stimuli, which, I mean, the whole notion of substance dualism doesn't even make sense because all of that can be explained purely physically. But apparently there's a missing ingredient which the soul brings to the picture. But what even is that? Like, what is lacking with the physical picture that the soul brings? Well, it's the qualia. But what does the qualia have to do with the activity of the brain? So what I'm saying here, it's not just that there's an interaction problem. It's that what does the soul have to do to the brain to make it conscious, right? It's like it doesn't seem that there's anything for it to do. It doesn't have to do anything. But so what is the point of it then? Well, it allows us to be conscious. Well, but what is it actually doing that allows us to be conscious? Well, it gives rise to consciousness. Like without it, you wouldn't have. Like it's just like you go around in circles. There's no articulation. It's not even just how does the soul do it. It's like what is it even doing other than simply being conscious? That's literally all there is to say about it. But remember, the notion of interaction of substance dualism is not that the soul itself is sufficient for consciousness. I'm not sure actually whether Eric thinks about that because people like Braxton, I don't know if Eric says this, but people like Braxton will appeal to and what's his face? No, it's not coming. Resurrection dude. Habermas, that's the one. Habermas also appeals to near-death experiences, which I think are inconsistent with the interactionist dualism, because they have a mind without any body, which is not what, again, dualism, dual two, you need the brain and the mind and the soul, let's say, to produce a mind, that they go together. The idea is that one alone is insufficient. At least that was Descartes' idea. But at least some of these Christians seem to think that the soul alone is sufficient for all of these things. And so there seems to be an overdetermination problem. Well, what is the body even doing? What is the brain even doing? If the soul does like perception and thinking and consciousness and all that stuff by itself, let alone how does it do that, but let's just say it just does somehow. What is the brain doing? And what causal effects does the soul need to exert on the brain in order to do anything, right? Because it seems to be perfectly fine at doing it all by itself. Now, presumably, they would want to say that at some point that the muscles in our body are controlled by the nervous system and not by the soul directly, unless they think the soul directly innervates our muscles. That would be an interesting discussion to have if someone went for that. But okay, let's suppose that our nervous system causally affects our muscles and leads us to move. So if our decision-making or our conscious perceptions affect our behavior, then they must do so through the nervous system. So it looks like there is something for the soul to do, but then it seems like that there's some gap, right? There's some explanatory gap that the soul has to fill, but it's sort of not clear what that is. Like what's missing from the story that we have in terms of the processing of stimuli in the brain that then leads us to our muscles to be innervated in a particular way. They don't seem to know what's missing there other than just consciousness or something. Yeah, but what physically is missing? What is the causal role that the soul is playing? There's just no account. The whole thing is just a jumble of nonsense. And all they have is these vague appeals to the Hoover Dam. They can't actually connect it in any way to what actually happens in the brain and where specifically in the system the soul is causally intervening. No, I'm not even saying how does it intervene. Here I'm just saying, what is it even doing? Like what causal effects is it exerting? Is it directly innervating our muscles? Presumably not. Okay, so it's intervening at some point in the brain. Like, what is it doing? What is the effect of the soul? They can't answer these questions because there are no answers to these questions. Because this whole notion of Cartesian dualism is based on a 17th century understanding of the brain, and it probably didn't even work then, right? But it certainly doesn't work now.
Or recent, which is really interesting, is appealing to something like quantum entanglement.
I knew it was going to
that. I had to look up when I first heard it, but essentially,
isn't that the spooky action at a distance?
Yes,
type thing.
That's right. It's essentially the idea, and we know this happens, that by doing, let's say you have two atoms, or I don't know if it's particles. I'm more of a philosopher than a scientist, and even that's a bit of an exaggeration. So I don't know the exact words, but you have these two things, and by either observing or doing one or measuring one, it has a cause effect on the other thing. And they're so far separated that there is no interaction.
It doesn't cause an effect.
It's also instantaneous.
Yes, that's right.
So it's like
it doesn't. There's no causal interaction there. Exactly what you want to say about what happens is going to depend on your interpretation of quantum physics. But what's clear is that the interaction is non-causal. The way that I like to think about it is that the system is distributed prior to measurement, and that there's an instantaneous collapse across the whole system. But that's not a causal interaction. It cannot be used to transmit information. It has no bearing whatsoever on these interactions problem because there's no causation in there's no causation in entangled quantum systems. Also, the brain is not an entangled quantum system, despite what Hammerhoff or whatever his name is says about it.
That's why they call it spooky action at a distance. It's because like you interact with this thing over here, and then it affects this thing way over here immediately.
No, it doesn't affect anything. It doesn't affect it.
Right. For Halloween, you should do
if by effect you mean causal effect, then no. If you mean if it means that we know epistemically what, like if you measure an electron, you know that one is. I can't point up and down at the same time. We know that one electron must be spin up and one is spin down, but we don't know which is which. And more fundamentally than that, there is no fact of the matter about which is which, but you measure one and it's spin up. So the other one, not only do you know it's spin down, but it sort of adopts the state of being spin down. Previously, it didn't have a well-defined state. It was a superposition of states, but it's immediately spin down. Now, it's counterintuitive because that sounds like causation, but it isn't, right? It's not a causal interaction. I guess you could say that you could say that the act of measurement collapses the wave function, but it doesn't. One state being up doesn't cause the other to be down. The whole thing is, I guess, distributed is the way I like to think about it. Anyway, we're getting further afield than we need to be. The interaction between one electron and the other is not a causal interaction. So that's just an improper way of describing it. It doesn't help the interaction problem because the interaction problem is expressly a causal interaction, whereas quantum entanglement is not a causal interaction, not between the two entangled like particles.
The spooky interaction.
Yes, good idea. I don't have a pencil. I read it.
It's being recorded.
Oh yeah.
So when you have this quantum entanglement, there's no energy really, unless I'm getting this wrong. But basically, in other words, you don't really need to do anything. There's no transfer of energy between these two things.
Yes, that's right.
So it could be the case that the soul, that there's some kind of relation to that the soul does something that doesn't take any kind of energy being created, but by doing something, even if it's observing or introspecting, whatever, has an effect on the physical. So which of those options, and there's other options, which of those work or is true? I don't know. At the end of the day, I'll say I think it's a primitive basic action. And I'm perfectly fine with saying I don't know the exact details, just like I drove my car here, even though I don't know the details. But suffice to say, there are responses out there to it. But just to recap, it's not an objection to the question. It's not an ontological argument or anything against it. It's epistemic. Nothing is lost, even if we say I don't know. And there are sufficient answers that people have argued for and how to explain that.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think the appropriate response is just say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Why are you so concerned about that? You know?
I think that's a good place to end this. So remember, when you ask Cameron, how is it that an immaterial substance interacts with the physical brain? He thinks that it is acceptable to say, I don't know, why are you concerned about that? So presumably, it's also acceptable to give that as an answer to when he asks a question like, how did something come from nothing? Or what caused the Big Bang? Or what grounds morality? Actually, I don't think he's too big on moral arguments, but, or what is the explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe or the apparent fine-tuning of the universe? Or how is it that consciousness arises from a material brain? Just remember that it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know, why are you so concerned about that? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the intellectual side of Christianity. I don't know why you're so concerned about that. You know, and maybe that's an answer that Nathan would like, actually. Let's get on with something that actually is actually useful in life. I mean, I actually do think it's a good question, right? So I wouldn't say that myself, but I think that we can do better than stuffing all of our mysteries into a bag and labeling it the soul, and then ultimately labeling that God. Yeah, that's actually my answer. Yeah, well, I think the issue here is that wasn't what they were saying in the first 1 hour of the conversation. It's only the answer when it's a question that the skeptic or the naturalist is asking them about their worldview. It's not an acceptable answer when it goes the other way. So at the very least, I think that we can say that that's an inconsistent approach to take. But I also think that these questions are very interesting. I think that there is a lot to say about mind and brain, and I think that the philosophical and scientific sides are both interesting, and there's worthwhile things to pursue there. There's a lot of nonsense in philosophy. There's a lot of nonsense in science too, let's be honest. Maybe the proportion is a bit more in philosophy, but I think you just have to look for the good and try to wallow through all of the nonsense. And what we've seen in this video is mostly nonsense. We had a half-hearted attempt at the indiscernibility of identicals argument against the mind and the brain being the same thing. We had a sort of, I think, inappropriate appeal to the Chinese room argument, and we had an argument about the composition argument, the impossibility of putting material things together and forming and getting consciousness out of that, and we had, there was another argument that was we also had the binding problem about different aspects of visual perception. How are they sort of integrated into a whole? There was the continuity of the soul over time, the sort of ship of Theseus issue there. So we had a number of issues arguments that were given in favor of, well, actually, none of those are arguments in favor of dualism. They're arguments against physicalism about the mind. As I said, I don't think any of them were articulated particularly well, and none of them were very convincing. Oh, and yeah, the sixth one was the inverted qualia argument as well, when you like flip red and blue and keep the function the same. Yeah, most of these are fairly standard arguments in the literature, although I don't think Eric did a very good job of articulating them, as I said. And I think I've tried to offer some, I think, reasonable objections to them. A meta objection is that even if you accept all of those criticisms of physicalism, that doesn't get you to substance dualism. You need to give further arguments as to why you think that is a good theory and a good explanation. As I've argued, I think that it solves nothing, explains nothing, and is just labeling a bunch of mysteries that you've shoved into a bag. We also don't, I guess maybe they're going to go there in the next 40 minutes, but somehow I doubt it. We don't really get any connection to what the soul has to do with God's existence. As far as I'm concerned, you could have souls and not God. I mean, traditional forms of Hinduism and Buddhism think something like this, right? Or I guess Buddhism doesn't think that there's a soul, but there's something that reincarnates. So I don't actually understand how that's supposed to work. But and traditional forms of Hinduism believe in, you know, the what do they call it, Atman, I guess the self, the soul, or something that reincarnates. Whereas they don't necessarily believe, at least in a theistic God. But anyway, so I'm just pointing out that there's different options on the table here, which as usual are just ignored in our simple dichotomy of it's either Christian theism or it's reductive naturalism. And unfortunately, we didn't get much discussion about AI, and not much about consciousness either in terms of what it actually is. So that was a little bit disappointing. I was hoping we'd hear a bit more about what the actual relationship between AI and like natural intelligence versus artificial intelligence was. Particularly, I'm interested to know why God can't create a soul for the AI, or for that matter, why God even needs to create a soul. I mean, everything that Eric has told us is consistent with the idea that souls kind of emerge, I don't know, like separately from or alongside the physical. So why couldn't an AI just kind of have its own soul, whether it's created by God or not? I don't actually know what the issue with that is. I mean, it sounds kind of dumb, but well, I think a lot of other things that we've heard today also sound kind of dumb. So I don't know that it's dumber than other possibilities. So just a whole lot of things that aren't even considered or properly addressed. And the last thing that we heard about, obviously, was a very poor response to the interaction problem objection, which I think culminated basically in Cameron just saying, "I don't know why you're so concerned about this." And I think that that's just a good way to end it. I don't know why you're so concerned about this. Let's not actually, you know, try to think about things or challenge our worldviews. Let's just throw up our hands and ask why you're so concerned about this. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you got something out of this. As you can see, I got rather frustrated by the end of it. It's just such bad argumentation. Yeah, but in terms of what's coming up, you can check out my podcast, the Science of Everything podcast, where I talk about actual neuroscience, among other things. We do a lot of topics, and so you can learn about what we actually know about the world instead of what pseudo-intellectuals pretend that we know or don't know about the world. So you can check that out. I don't know when I'll be doing another video when I get the chance. I've been bugging Nathan for a while about doing not necessarily a BA, because I think he's kind of over apologetics at the moment, but at least a video about, I don't know, AI or something. But so I'm not sure what the state of that is, but perhaps that will occur at some point in the future. What else is there? Oh yeah, I might post a link to this. I've been writing an article about like GPT-4 and chatbots and things like that, which might be of interest to some people here. So maybe I'll do some kind of video about that at some point. I think that would be interesting to talk about. So yeah, we'll see if I can get something going about that. So there's that happening. Continuing to work on my book slowly but surely. At some point, I will maybe do a video talking about that in more detail once I'm at that point, but who knows when that will be. And yeah, I'm working on my thesis. As I mentioned, that takes up most of my time. So I'll try to get in another video when I have an opportunity, possibly in a month or two. But yeah, I'm nearly 2 years in now, so a year and a bit to go. But anyway, that's enough on me. Thanks for coming, everyone. And I hope you got something out of this. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.